Chapter 51. Duan Xinghui was firm in his thoughts. He was not wrong. He loved Arya, but why couldn't Arya be considerate of him? If a man had no career and no career that he was proud of, he would be much inferior. Now Duan Xinghui felt a little drunk every day. He felt that his future was confused. Duan Xinghui returned to the Duan mansion with a bottle of wine and met the anxious Mrs. Duan. "Mother, what's wrong?" Duan Xinghui asked Mrs. Duan. Mrs. Duan looked at the decadent Duan Xinghui and her heart was about to break. But there was something more important. She said, Arya went to the princess mansion to make trouble. Duan Xinghui shivered and sobered up. He threw down the wine bottle and turned to the princess mansion. He looked anxious. Even Duan Xinghui himself didn't know why he was so anxious. It was undeniable that he suddenly wanted to see Princess Jiehui. There was a secret thought in his heart. He hoped that Princess Jiehui could plead with the emperor for the sake of their past friendship. When Duan Xinghui arrived at the princess mansion, he saw Arya in green kneeling in front of the princess mansion. The guards at the gate of the princess mansion were looking at Arya vigilantly. There were many people around. At this moment, for some reason, Duan Xinghui didn't even have the courage to lift his foot and walk to Arya. He only felt confused. Ning Shu heard Little Hong say that Arya was making trouble at the gate. She felt bad. She stayed at home, but the people of the Duan mansion always came to make trouble. She felt drunk. Ning Shu touched the whip at her waist. When Xiao Hong saw the princess's action, she knew that the princess was angry. All the guards in the princess's residence had been drilled by the princess. They were used as targets by the princess to practice her whip skills. Ning Shu walked to the gate. She wanted to see what these people were going to do. At that time, they couldn't blame her for being impolite. The moment Ning Shu came out, Duan Xinghui felt as if time had slowed down. He saw Princess Jiehui, who was still wearing her riding clothes with a whip hanging from her waist. Her long ponytail made her look elegant and noble, which made people sigh in admiration. Ning Shu came out and stood on the steps. He carefully looked at Arya, who was kneeling on the ground. Her face was painted with makeup, and her eyebrows were drawn into thin willow leaf eyebrows. She was dressed in silk and satin. Ning Shu could only say that this dress was really ugly. Arya originally had thick eyebrows and big eyes, but she insisted on making her willow eyebrows. Her eyebrows and eyes were not in proportion. Now Ning Shu felt that Arya was not as good as the first time he saw her at the city gate. Looking at the high and mighty Princess Jiehui, her whole body seemed to be shining, especially her flawless face. There were no pearls or jade on her body, but she was so noble that people could not look directly at her. Arya felt more and more inferior in her heart. She thought of what Yuan Dong said. Princess Jiehui should have been Duan Lang's wife, and Duan Lang should have been the prince consort. Yuan Dong said that it was all because of her that Princess Jiehui was angry, and Duan Lang lost his position as the general. Arya wanted to beg Princess Jiehui to not blame Duan Lang anymore. "Princess, do you still remember me?" Arya asked Ning Shu. Ning Shu was speechless. Was it really okay to talk to a princess like this in such a tone? "Princess, it's all my fault. Please don't blame Duan Lang anymore." Arya bitterly shouted to Ning Shu. "Please don't be angry. As long as you don't blame Duan Lang, I will do anything you want." Duan Xinghui, who was standing in the crowd, had a complicated expression on his face. His heart was sour, sweet, bitter, spicy, and salty. He was both touched and embarrassed. Ning Shu, on the other hand, felt as if his balls were about to burst. What the hell did this mean? He felt that he was the villain who broke up the Mandarin ducks. She had never thought of getting involved in this person's love, but these people still insisted on finding her. These words sounded like he was using public office to avenge private wrongs. If he had a temper, he should go find Li Wen. It was Li Wen who gave the imperial edict. Why did he come and make trouble with her? Did he really think that he was a pushover? Ning Shu took the whip from his waist. The male lead had already whipped her. He didn't know how it felt to whip the female lead. How did she become so violent? Not good, not good. Duan Xinghui saw the princess take off the whip. He thought of the pain of the whip on a person's body. It was as if his meridians were broken. Even when he saw the whip now, Duan Xinghui felt that his arm was very painful. Duan Xinghui quickly ran over, hugged Arya who was kneeling on the ground, and dodged to one side to avoid Ning Shu's whip. Ning Shu calmly took back his whip. He had long found Duan Xinghui in the crowd. Tut, tut, he let his woman kneel here and beg for mercy, while he hid aside. This Duan Xinghui's character, tut, tut. Ning Shu really didn't know what made the original owner so persistent about Duan Xinghui. He guessed that she was not reconciled in her heart and got angry. She had to snatch this man. It was good to have someone snatching it, and people were the same. Looking carefully, Duan Xinghui was not a good person at all. Arya looked at Duan Xinghui in astonishment, and tears fell down. She couldn't help hugging Duan Xinghui in public. Greetings to Princess Jiahui. Duan Xinghui stood in front of Arya. Ning Shu saluted with a fist and palm salute. Ning Shu hummed and said nothing. She stood on the steps and looked down at Duan Xinghui. Such a posture made Duan Xinghui uncomfortable. Although he knew that Princess Jiahui really had no feelings for him, her behavior really made Duan Xinghui feel very uncomfortable. In the past, Princess Jiahui would not do such a contemptuous action to him. Your Highness, this matter has nothing to do with Arya. Why did your Highness do such a thing? Arya is a woman. How can she withstand your Highness's whip? Duan Xinghui said in a reproachful tone. Ning Shu pursed her lips and suddenly laughed. How dare you? Are you blaming me? Duan Xinghui didn't take care of your woman. The next time you come to my mansion to make trouble, I'll get out of the capital. I'll make you unable to stay in the capital. If there's a next time. Ning Shu pointed at Duan Xinghui and Arya with her whip. I'll whip your faces. Do you really think I? Cough, my princess mansion is a vegetable market. You come to my door every day to make trouble. Ning Shu said and whipped Duan Xinghui on the shoulder. Duan Xinghui let out a muffled groan, his face deathly pale. Arya, on the other hand, was scared silly. Seeing Duan Xinghui stumble twice and kneel on the ground, she wailed and cried, Duan Lang, Duan Lang. Arya looked at Ning Shu with fear in her eyes. Her black face suddenly turned white and looked much better. Duan Xinghui covered his wound. He had just recovered and now he was whipped again. Duan Xinghui raised his head and looked at Ning Shu's cold and impatient face. His heart trembled. Only now did Duan Xinghui truly understand that Princess Jiahui was no longer the gentle and considerate person who used to be. She was full of the pride and nobility of a member of the imperial family. Looking at his strange and cold eyes, Duan Xinghui felt some pain in his heart. He lost something that he didn't cherish before. It made him feel uncomfortable and angry. Why did the princess become like this? Chapter 52. When Madame Duan saw that her son was injured again, she was distressed and angry. This anger was directed at Ning Shu and Arya. Because of Princess Jiahui's identity, Madame Duan did not dare to show her resentment. But for Arya, Madame Duan did not hesitate to stare at her fiercely and viciously. Seeing Madame Duan's eyes, Ning Shu did not hesitate to believe that Madame Duan wanted to kill Arya. There was no more harmonious mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship as in the original plot. Ning Shu felt very comfortable. The happy life of Duan Xinghui, Arya, and Madame Duan was built on the original owner. Thinking of a princess ending up like that, Ning Shu felt intoxicated. Princess, why did you do this? Duan Xinghui's face was pale, and he asked Ning Shu in a trembling voice. Why did she do this? Ning Shu sneered. I was happy. Seeing that Duan Xinghui was angry but did not dare to say anything and covered his wound, Ning Shu said lightly, I just swung my whip, and you hit it. Listening to such unreasonable words, Duan Xinghui almost vomited blood and looked at Ning Shu ferociously. Duan Xinghui, without the halo of a general, was so down and out. His face was unshaven, and he looked so decadent. He did not have the courage and calmness on horseback in the original owner's memory. Tut tut, seeing the princess sizing him up, Duan Xinghui didn't know why, but he felt embarrassed. He didn't want the princess to see him like this. He wanted to show his best side in front of her. Duan Xinghui unconsciously puffed out his chest. Ning Shu looked away and said to Madame Duan, who was unhappy, Madame Duan, I respect you as an elder. Take care of your family. If there is a next time, I can't guarantee anything. Madame Duan looked at Princess Jiahui, who seemed to be a different person. She lowered her head, gritted her teeth, and bowed. Thank you for your forgiveness, Princess. I promise there will be no next time. Madame Duan's heart felt as if it had been ruthlessly ravaged by someone. She had lost her husband in her early years, but she had gritted her teeth and endured it, allowing her son to be so outstanding. Madame Duan had a tough personality, but she was also an extremely intelligent woman. Madame Duan felt offended when Princess Jiahui, who was originally in her hands, suddenly lost control of herself. Especially when Princess Jiahui was so rude to her. To put it bluntly, Madame Duan had been spoiled by the previous Princess Jiahui. Now that Ning Shu was acting like a princess, Madame Duan couldn't stand it anymore. Mrs. Duan covered up her thoughts and left with the injured Duan Xinghui. Ning Shu also saw with his sharp eyes that Mrs. Duan pinched Gu Aria's waist twice. Aria jumped up in pain, but Duan Xinghui didn't see it at all. Ning Shu smiled. It was estimated that Aria would have a hard time in the future. Mrs. Duan had many means to deal with people. His own mother dealt with his beloved. He didn't know if Duan Xinghui would treat the original owner as coldly and ruthlessly as he did in the plot. Tut tut, both the palm and the back of the hand were flesh. It hurt to be hit with a wooden stick. Ha! Ning Shu laughed very unsympathetically. Ning Shu counted the days and took a horse out of the stable. He was ready to go to the royal manor to see the growth of the sweet potatoes. It should be the season for sweet potatoes to be harvested now, but he didn't know what they looked like. Ning Shu didn't take anyone with him. He rode to the manor alone. Speaking of riding, Ning Shu felt that it was very hard. The process of learning to ride was full of bitterness and tears. After learning for 2 or 3 months, he could finally shoot an arrow on the back of the horse without holding the reins, so that he wouldn't fall to the ground. When they arrived at the manor, Shen Qingqing gave the reins to the steward and went straight to the place where the sweet potatoes were planted. When they arrived at the land where the sweet potatoes were planted, the sweet potatoes were growing lush and green. It seemed that the people in the manor were taking good care of them. Ning Shu took a hoe and dug up a few stalks of sweet potatoes. The result surprised Ning Shu. The red skin of the sweet potatoes was the size of a fist. Ning Shu laughed from the bottom of his heart. Whether it was because of the mission or because there was another type of food that could satisfy the hunger of the common people, Ning Shu's heart was full of excitement. Dig up all of these sweet potatoes for this princess and measure the land. This princess wants to calculate the yield. Ning Shu said loudly. There were many tenant farmers in the manor. In a short while, the potatoes were all dug up. The steward took a scale and began to weigh the sweet potatoes. Princess, this thing actually has a yield of 500 jin. The steward Ning Shu said. Ning Shu was very happy. In this era, the influence of various conditions, such as drought or flood, had an impact on the yield of grain. It was good to have a yield of 700 gen of rice. In special times, having sweet potatoes could at least satisfy hunger. Moreover, it was a crop that was resistant to drought. Move some of this princess's manor. As for the rest, dig up a cellar and store them well. After a while, the emperor may come to inspect. This time, you have done a great service. Wait for the reward. The steward and the tenant farmer's face showed joy. They said in unison, "Thank you, princess." The tenant farmers moved a basket of sweet potatoes to the princess's manor. When Ning Shu returned to the princess's manor, he roasted the sweet potatoes. While the sweet potatoes were still warm, he directly rode to the palace. When he arrived at the palace gate, he dismounted and went to Li Wen's imperial study. Li Wen was discussing matters with the ministers. Ning Shu waited at the door for a while before he saw the ministers come out one after another. When they saw Ning Shu, their eyes were very strange. Ning Shu's heart jumped. According to the time, it should be the time when the Xiongnu people requested the marriage. Then what was the meaning of these people's eyes? Could it be that they still wanted to go for the marriage? Fuck. Ning Shu collected his chaotic thoughts and carried the food box in. Ning Shu saw the little gray ball lying on the desk sleeping. He did not know if it was Ning Shu's illusion, but the little gray ball had grown fat. Its body was rounder than before. Li Wen narrowed his eyes and looked at Ning Shu. He asked, "Why did you suddenly come to find me?" "Royal brother, your sister has brought you something good." Ning Shu lifted the food box in his hand. Li Wen looked at the food box with an indifferent expression. There were too many people sending things to his study. Li Wen really did not have any thoughts. Hearing Ning Shu's voice, the little gray ball opened its eyes. Its black bean-like eyes looked at him. Its wet nose twitched. It propped up its body and used its claws to dig at the food box. This guy's nose is so sharp. Royal brother, you will be very happy when you see this. Ning Shu looked at Li Wen's indifferent expression and felt even worse. This guy is not really going to marry me, right? The little gray ball squeaked. Ning Shu opened the food box and took out the roasted sweet potatoes. Suddenly, a sweet smell filled the air, but it was very refreshing. The roasted sweet potatoes on the plate did not look good. Li Wen narrowed his eyes and looked at the things on the plate. He seemed to have thought of something and looked at Ning Shu with a questioning gaze. Chapter 53. The little gray ball directly fell onto the plate. Ning Shu quickly shook it off and took one to break into two. He ate half of it and handed the other half to Li Wen. Ning Shu's actions were to tell Li Wen that this thing could be eaten and that it wasn't poisonous. Li Wen took the sweet potato. The skin of the sweet potato was still stained with black ash. Li Wen imitated Ning Shu and peeled the skin before eating it. It tasted sweet. Li Wen nodded. What food is this? Ning Shu saw that Li Wen's expression was still interested, so he said, "Brother, I call this thing sweet potato. It's something I found in the manor last time. I've sent people to plant it. The output has reached 500 kilograms, Ning Shu said. This thing can fill one's hunger. Is that so? Li Wen's face revealed anxiety and surprise. Clearly, he understood the use of this thing. Does the manor still have this thing? I got people to keep it well. It's now in the manor's cellar, Ning Shu said. Li Wen nodded and said, I'll leave the palace with you and go to the manor to take a look. All right. Li Wen definitely had to take a look at such a matter that concerned the livelihood of the people. Li Wen and Ning Shu rode straight to the manor with a group of cavalry following behind them. When the emperor went out, he had to have someone by his side. When they arrived at the manor, Li Wen first looked at the potatoes and then at the land where the potatoes were planted. He got someone to measure the land again and the result was the same. Li Wen, who had always been cold, revealed a slight smile. His eyes were very bright as he looked at Ning Shu with a gentler gaze. He said to Ning Shu, "Jiahui, you're very good. Very good." Ning Shu only smiled and said, "I'm very happy to be able to work for you. I know that you have the people in your heart. I'm a member of the royal family and rely on the people to support me. It's only right for me to work for the people." It could be said that the entire noble class was supported by the people, but these nobles still looked down on the people. Li Wen clearly did not expect that Ning Shu would say such words. She was gratified and said, "Jiahui has grown up and is sensible. She's no longer obsessed with those inexplicable matters." Ning Shu sweated profusely. "I'll have to trouble you with the planting in the future." There was a slight smile on Li Wen's face. Her attitude towards Ning Shu was very gentle. The steward of the manor and the tenant farmers know what to do. Actually, I found it by accident. It's not a big deal. It would be great if I could help Imperial Brother. By the way, how did you find out that this thing is edible? Li Wen squinted her eyes and asked. Ning Shu's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't say that she knew. Speaking of which, it's all because of the little gray ball. Sister Chen saw this little thing holding this thing in the woods, and then she tasted it herself. Although the raw one is not as delicious as the cooked one, Ning Shu directly pushed the blame to the little gray ball. Li Wen knew that the little gray ball liked to eat. Li Wen nodded and floated back to the palace. Ning Shu heaved a sigh of relief. She had finally proven her worth in front of Li Wen. She should have hesitated a little when she was asked to go through with the marriage. But Ning Shu's heart was still heavy. Then the next marriage, whether the task could be successful or not depended on this marriage. In fact, the task this time was almost completed. Don't love Duan Xinghui. Well, it was done. Let Duan Xinghui and Area, this pair of bitches, not have a good ending. Well, this was almost the same. If it went on like this, it was estimated that Area and Duan Xinghui would become a resentful couple. There were many obstacles in their love. In the original plot, it was because Area saved a marquis's wife that her status was raised and Madame Duan accepted her. But because of Yuan Dong stirring up trouble in the Duan manor, Area couldn't even go out and had to learn the rules every day. He really didn't know if Area would be bound by the rules and act according to the rules. Would Duan Xinghui still like her? Ha ha ha, sure enough, as Ning Shu expected, it didn't take long for the Xiongnu envoys to arrive in the capital. This time, it was the second son of the Khan, the second prince of the grassland. The original host was married to this second prince. In the capital, he heard that the original host was fighting for a man with a filthy reputation. He had a bad impression of the original host. After the marriage, he was treated inhumanely. The Xiongnu was a place without propriety, justice, integrity, and shame. Women were like goods there. Although the original host was married to the second prince, what made the original host collapse was that the second prince's brothers would share her and humiliate her. This was simply a place where the devil stayed. The original host was very afraid of the second prince. Now, when he heard the second prince's name, Ning Shu's body couldn't help trembling. This was the original host's emotion. Fear was mixed with hatred. Generally speaking, it was mostly fear. After suffering so much torture, the original host was like a mouse seeing a cat when he saw the second prince. He had the fear of being killed. Ning Shu clenched his fist. He was determined not to be married to the second prince. Otherwise, how could he help the original host counterattack? If he wanted to change the original host's fate, he had to change the fate of the marriage. Sure enough, the Xiongnu envoys proposed the marriage in the court. Moreover, they requested the great Yong's only princess Jiahui. The ministers all said that they wanted Ning Shu to be married, but Li Wen didn't say anything. He seemed to agree, but also seemed to disagree. He didn't say anything, making the Xiongnu envoys somewhat dissatisfied. However, they didn't dare to be presumptuous. Sure enough, this was the power of the plot. Even though Ning Shu's reputation hadn't been tarnished, and she hadn't been involved in the scandal of a dignified princess fighting for a man, she still couldn't avoid the fate of the marriage. The canon fodder supporting female lead was truly miserable. What could she do now? She could only stop crying and stand up. What made Ning Shu rejoice was that Li Wan did not immediately agree to the marriage. Clearly, the matter of the sweet potato occupied a bit of a place in Li Wen's heart. Sure enough, currying favor with Li Wen was the most correct choice. Since he was at the side of the emperor, who held the power of life and death in his hands, he had to surmise the emperor's thoughts. Clearly, Ning Shu had gambled correctly. The envoys settled down in the capital. What made Ning Shu speechless was that the second prince actually came to the princess's residence to pay a visit. Ning Shu only had one word for this: scram. Sure enough, the second prince didn't follow the rules. What would others think of the second prince coming to pay a visit like this? She reckoned that she and the second prince already had an affair. Fuck, this second prince was truly sinister and extremely malicious. Ning Shu didn't hesitate to use the greatest malice to speculate about the second prince. In the original host's memories, the second prince had the cruelty and craftiness of a wild wolf of the grasslands. His natural disposition was malicious, and his torture of the original host was simply beyond the limits of what a human could endure. After marrying him, Princess Jiahui was tortured to death 2 years later. Ning Shu remained in the princess's residence, refusing to leave. The second prince didn't see Princess Jiahui and could only return in disappointment. He had heard that Princess Jiahui was quite beautiful. Chapter 54. When the second prince left, Ning Shu packed up and prepared to go to the palace. Damn, Ning Shu didn't believe that the second prince would actually block her in the palace. With Li Wen in the palace, the second prince wouldn't dare to jump around in front of Li Wen even if he had 10 times the courage. After all this time, she still had to go back to the palace. Ning Shu sat in the carriage and the carriage went to the palace. She didn't know why Ning Shu was a little uneasy. It was undeniable that the original owner's deep-rooted fear had affected her, so she had to hurry to confirm the marriage with Li Wen. She thought that this task was simple. Compared with the trivial matter of Duan Xinghui in area, it was nothing in front of national affairs. The most important thing in this task was not to be married. Ning Shu was thinking about something when the carriage suddenly stopped. The horse neighed. Ning Shu in the carriage grabbed the wooden frame to stabilize her body and said, "What's going on?" "Princess. Princess, did someone control the horse?" the coachman said with some trepidation. Ning Shu had a bad feeling in her heart. She bit her lips and lifted the curtain. She saw a man holding the reins of the horse, stopping the running horse. Ning Shu saw the man. She didn't feel anything in her heart, but her body trembled in fear. It was the second prince. Damn, Ning Shu endured all kinds of tumbling emotions in her heart. She gritted her teeth and took the whip from her waist to whip the man. However, the second prince actually dodged Ning Shu's whip. He turned over and sat on the back of the horse pulling the carriage, looking at Ning Shu in surprise. Ning Shu's heart sank. The second prince could actually dodge her whip. She had practiced the whip for so long and was very skilled and fast. She had whipped Duan Xinghui twice, but Duan Xinghui didn't dodge. This man was much stronger than Duan Xinghui. "You are Princess Jiahui. Why did you hit me when you saw me?" The second prince looked at Ning Shu with sharp and explicit eyes, with satisfaction in his eyes. Under the second prince's eyes, Ning Shu's body trembled uncontrollably. This was the body's conditioned reflex of fear. She was afraid of this man. "Do you know who I am?" the second prince asked Ning Shu. His voice was very low, with a hint of magnetism, but it gave Ning Shu a creepy feeling. That feeling was like the sound of a snake's skin rubbing against fine sand. Ning Shu coldly snorted and didn't speak. She was afraid that if she spoke, her voice would reveal her trembling voice. The second prince dodged again and stared at Ning Shu with a pair of sharp eyes. He berated, "This prince is talking to you. Why aren't you replying? Are you Princess Jiehui? Damn, how could this man be so powerful?" Ning Shu bit her lips. She had to overcome this body's fear of the man in front of her. She had to completely control this body so that she wouldn't be controlled by it. Ning Shu wondered when she would be able to suppress her emotions during the mission. Ning Shu took a deep breath and shouted. She jumped down from the carriage and started to fight with the second prince. Ning Shu clenched her teeth and swung her whip with all her strength. The whip violently rubbed against the air, creating an explosive sound. Seeing that Ning Shu was acting as if he had killed his father, the second prince had no choice but to become serious. As he dodged the whip, he tried to approach Ning Shu and restrain Ning Shu. However, Ning Shu refused to let him get close. If it weren't for the weak flow of air in his body, Ning Shu probably wouldn't have been able to hold on. Fuck, why is this perverted man so powerful? The second prince seemed to have lost his patience and suddenly grabbed Ning Shu's whip. The spikes on the whip pierced the second prince's palm. The second prince released Ning Shu's whip in shock. Looking at his bloody palm, he frowned. What are you doing? I only wanted to say a few words to you. Are you crazy? Ning Shu's entire body was drenched in cold sweat. His fear of the second prince lessened. This was still Great Yong's territory. Even if Ning Shu ignored him, he wouldn't dare do anything. Are you Jiehui? The second prince ignored the blood on his hand as he asked Ning Shu. Ning Shu nobly raised his chin and indifferently replied, "This prince is Princess Jiehui." Audacious madman, you actually dare to block this prince's carriage. Hearing Ning Shu admit that he was Princess Jiehui, the second prince's eyes brightened. The corners of his mouth curled up as he said, "You should know who I am. The person who wants to marry you, Helianing. Remember that?" Helianing enunciated each word clearly. Ning Shu was so angry that he laughed. Why did the second prince think that he wanted to marry him? Ning Shu couldn't be bothered to speak with the second prince. He directly boarded the carriage and said to the driver, "Enter the palace." This time, Helianing didn't stop Ning Shu. Instead, she watched until the horse carriage disappeared around the corner. Then, she lowered her head and looked at her own hand. Blood dripped onto the bluestone pavement of the street, splashing into a flower of blood. Princess Jiehui, Li Shuashan. Ning Shu first returned to his palace, Orchid Palace Hall, and was warmly welcomed by Miao Qing. After not seeing her for a while, Ning Shu felt that Miao Qing, this flower, had withered a lot. Guarding such an empty palace hall was no different from the cold palace. Ning Shu didn't have any good feelings towards Miao Qing. Ning Shu had just sat in Orchid Palace Hall for a while when the Empress arrived. When she saw Ning Shu, the first thing she asked was whether he wanted to live in the palace for a long time. Ning Shu nodded, and the Empress smiled. Then, after a few polite words, her face became melancholy. Ning Shu said, "It's a pity that you are going to marry someone. I will persuade your brother not to let you go to that barren place. It's a pity that noble concubine Du's mother's family firmly supports your marriage in the imperial court. How can noble concubine Du be so cruel to let a girl like you leave her hometown?" The battle between the Empress and noble concubine Du had always been fierce. At this time, the Empress still wanted to deal with noble concubine Du before her marriage. Obviously, the Empress thought that she couldn't escape this time. As for persuading Li Wan, this kind of words should be listened to. If it was taken seriously, it would be disgusting. Ning Shu was really tired and said directly, "Sister-in-law, whether I will marry someone or not, it's up to my brother to decide. It's not up to you or noble concubine Du to decide." Ning Shu's words were a bit impolite. She almost directly said, "Don't meddle in my affairs." Looking at Ning Shu's ugly face, the empress was very worried. She cursed in her heart that she deserved the marriage, but on the surface, she showed an understanding expression and persuaded Ningxu, you don't have to worry too much. Your brother loves you so much. He won't let you leave your hometown alone. Although she was persuading, her tone was sour. Ningxu said directly, sister-in-law, I'm tired. The empress's face stiffened, and finally she could only leave. After the empress left, the imperial concubines in the harem all rushed to Orchid Palace Hall. Ningxu was really impatient to see these people. Her time was not wasted on these women. Chapter 55. When he saw the second prince before entering the palace, he was even more determined to not go through with the marriage. This was not only a task, but also the reaction of this body when he saw the second prince. The fear and despair in his heart made Ningxu sad. He did not even have the thought of resisting, only fear, like a lamb to be slaughtered. Ningxu tidied up for a while and went to the imperial study to find Li Wen. As if knowing that Ningxu would come back, the eunuch beside Li Wen let Ningxu in. Ningxu took a deep breath and walked in. Li Wen was reviewing memorials. When Ningxu came in, he did not raise his head. After Ningxu bowed, Li Wen put down the cinnabar pen in his hand, looked at Ningxu and asked, have you eaten? No. Ningxu said honestly, my sister is upset and can't eat. Li Wen said directly, the second prince of the northern desert, Lian, wants to marry you. Our two countries should be on good terms. What do you think? Ningxu sneered. The Xiongnu people were the Xiongnu people. Did they think that the northern desert was high and mighty? Brother, do you want to hear a lie or the truth? Ningxu looked straight at Li Wen. Li Wen raised his eyebrows, just say it. Ningxu knelt on the ground, bit his lips and said, my sister doesn't want to go through with the marriage. Oh, the reason? Li Wen's expression was indifferent, as if he was not surprised by Ningxu's refusal. My sister has already fought with Lian. He is very powerful, but there is an even more powerful prince above him. Ningxu gritted his teeth and said. When he came to this world, Ningxu knew clearly about the original owner of the body. According to the original owner's memory, when the original owner married, the two of them fought fiercely. Yes, I did. Are you hurt? Li Wen's eyes were watery as she looked at Ningxu with a gentle gaze. Imperial brother, bandits are bandits. The Xiongnu plundered the borders of the Great Yong Empire and killed the citizens of the Great Yong Empire. This kind of bandit behavior should not be forgiven. Chen Mei has enjoyed the glory of the imperial family and can marry into the Great Yong Empire to repay the imperial family. However, this kind of behavior will only encourage the other party's arrogance. For the Grand Great Yong dynasty to compromise like this, how can we face the people living on the border? Ningxu gritted his teeth. In addition, this time, the Xiongnu not only want to marry the princess of Great Yong, they also want to scrape away the wealth of the common people. If there is a first time, there will be a second time. Ningxu's tone was filled with grief and indignation. This was no longer an attempt to persuade Li Wen, but rather the feelings of the original owner. The original owner had personally witnessed the people living on the border being captured and enslaved. However, at that time, the original owner had been in hell, painfully struggling. His life was even more miserable than that of the slaves. Li Wen's expression was somewhat cold. It was unknown whether it was because of Ningxu's words or because of other reasons, but the current Li Wen's aura was very cold. The dignity and solemnity of an emperor made Ningxu somewhat unable to breathe. Ningxu clenched his teeth and knelt on the ground. Sonorously and forcefully, he said, Imperial brother, Chen Mei is willing to become Imperial brother's pawn. I want Imperial brother's dynasty to not marry into the Great Yong Empire, to not pay reparations, to not cede land, and to not pay tribute. The Son of Heaven will guard the country's gates, and the monarch will die to protect the country. Li Wen stared blankly, looking at Ning Shu with a complicated expression. He asked, "What do you want to do?" "Chop off the hand that the Xiongnu have extended into Great Yong. If we continue to beat them until they are afraid, Chen Mei is willing to take command of the battlefield and not rest until my death." Ning Shu spoke sonorously and forcefully, even his body trembling slightly. Li Wen's lips curled into a smile. Walking around the desk, he walked in front of Ning Shu. Extending his hand, he helped Ning Shu up. Somewhat unable to stifle his laughter, he said, "Since ancient times, when has there ever been a woman taking command? There were too many. Hua Mulan, Mu Guiying. It seemed that there were no precedents in this world. We will not allow you to marry into the Great Yong Empire. As for the matter of taking command, we will consider it again. Go and have your meal." Li Wen warmly said, appearing somewhat like an older brother. "Jiehui, you have become sensible." Every time he heard Li Wen say that he had become sensible, Ning Shu would sweat profusely. Exiting the imperial study, Ning Shu's entire body was weak and limp, his back covered in cold sweat. He could finally put down the large stone in his heart. Returning to the Orchid Garden Palace Hall, Ning Shu ate a little before lying down on his bed and falling into a deep sleep. After sleeping for an unknown amount of time, he was awakened by Miao Qing, who said that there was a banquet for the Northern Desert's diplomatic mission. Ning Shu took off his light riding clothes and put on the luxurious princess's palace attire that he had not worn in a long time. His head was filled with ornaments, and his clothes were long-sleeved. It was incomparably complicated. Ning Shu felt somewhat unaccustomed to it, feeling as if his neck was about to be bent from the weight of the things on his head. Miao Qing wanted to follow Ning Shu, but how could Ning Shu allow her to do as she wished? He wanted to make sure that she did not see Li Wen. "You will die of thirst." Under Miao Qing's deeply hidden resentment, Ning Shu walked towards the banquet hall. The hall was brightly lit, and the sound of musical instruments poured out from every corner of the hall. Mixed with the intoxicating atmosphere, it formed a flashy and pleasurable atmosphere that made people indulge in. Ning Shu walked into the hall, causing the atmosphere in the hall to become heavy. Everyone looked at Ning Shu. Ning Shu cursed in his heart. These men were enjoying themselves, and using a woman in exchange for peace. Were they still men? "Jiehui, come to me." Li Wen beckoned Ning Shu. Ning Shu ignored the domineering gaze of the second prince from the Northern Desert's diplomatic mission group. He walked to Li Wen, bowed to Li Wen, and then sat down on his own seat. Helian Ying's gaze followed him like a shadow. Ning Shu felt as if there were nails piercing into his body, making him extremely uncomfortable. "What are you looking at?" Helian Ying glared at Ning Shu, and then froze for a moment. Previously, when he was fighting with this fellow, he did not notice. Now that he looked at him, this fellow's appearance was truly wild. His hair was loose, his collar was slightly open, and he wore a necklace strung together with wolf fangs. He had a thin waist and narrow buttocks. His skin was bronze, and his facial features were deep. From head to toe, he was brimming with masculinity and wildness. He was different from the men of the Great Yong dynasty. The men of the Great Yong dynasty were particular about elegance and nobility. TSK. No matter how good-looking he was, it could not hide his scum nature. His personality was wild and cruel. This kind of man was a nightmare for women. Seeing that Ning Shu was sizing him up, second Prince Helianing bared his white teeth at Ning Shu. His eyes were filled with the determination to win. Especially when the other party's cold gaze was sizing him up, Helianing felt the blood in his heart begin to boil. It was like a wild wolf that had found its target, with a cruel gaze and expectation. She was different from the light clothes she wore before. She looked valiant and formidable, and her entire body carried a fierce aura. Now, she was dressed in luxurious clothes, and her expression was cold. Under the contrast of her luxurious clothes, she looked exceptionally proud and noble. Helianing suddenly laughed. Under the illumination of the light, his white teeth reflected a snow-white light, making people feel a chill in their hearts. Liaoning raised his wine cup and drank a cup of wine from Ning Shu, his eyes shining brightly. Ning Shu sneered, turned his head and did not look at him. He also pretended that he did not see Liaoning's toast. Chapter 56. Ning Shu looked at the complacent Liaoning and sneered. How could he be so certain that he would marry Princess Yong? Liaoning was too confident. In any case, Great Yong was a large country. The current Princess Jiahui was not as loathsome as in the plot. Halfway through the banquet, when the dancers had all left, Liaoning stood up from his seat and walked to the center of the hall. His movements were filled with explosive power, as if a cheetah had suddenly leapt out. His masculine face alone could charm many women, but his insides were pitch black. Seeing Liaoning's actions, everyone thought that the main show had arrived. In reality, today's banquet would determine Princess Jiahui's future fate. Liaoning first glanced at Ning Shu, who was sitting there with an indifferent expression and a mocking expression. Liaoning smiled and cupped his fist towards Ning Shu. In a clear voice, he said, "Great Yong's Imperial Majesty, my country is willing to marry Great Yong to form friendly relations." Liaoning looked at Ning Shu. This prince fell in love with Princess Jiahui at first sight. My heart is in love with her. Ning Shu rolled his eyes. What fucking fell in love with her? Ning Shu gave him the middle finger in his mind. What heart is in love with her? Nothing more than taking a fancy to Jiahui's dowry and fief. Immoral. Ning Shu did not even bother to look at Liaoning. He lowered his head and drank his fruit wine, unperturbed. Li Wen's gaze wandered back and forth between Liaoning and Ning Shu. Li Wen's expression was somewhat unsightly, his gaze deep. Li Wen indifferently asked, "Jiahui, what do you think?" "You are in love with the second prince of the northern desert." Li Wen did not even mention Liaoning's name, directly addressing the second prince of the northern desert. Ning Shu stood up, sonorously and forcefully saying, "My younger sister does not like the second prince of the northern desert." Li Wen nodded his head in satisfaction and said to Liaoning, "Jiahui is our only younger sister. Naturally, I am unwilling to have my younger sister marry off to another country." The expression on Liaoning's face froze. Soon after, she looked at Ning Shu with a smile that wasn't a smile. She didn't say anything, but she also knew that she hadn't achieved her goal this time. At this moment, Ning Shu finally breathed a sigh of relief. He had finally escaped the fate of a political marriage, but the price was expensive. Ning Shu glanced at Liaoning and met his gaze. Liaoning's gaze appeared malicious and deep. On the other hand, Ning Shu felt like he was being stared at by Lone Wolf. Ning Shu expressed that he was not afraid of Lone Wolf. Since a political marriage was not possible, then the goal of having the Great Yong dynasty cede territory and pay reparations, as well as the dowry of a princess, could not be achieved. Before the Mabe diplomatic mission left, they faced the capital and pointed their fingers, vowing to make the Great Yong dynasty pay the price. Liaoning sat on horseback and raised her head to look at Ning Shu, who was standing on top of the city gate. Ning Shu was wearing a light riding outfit and her hair was tied into a high ponytail. She looked down from above and met her gaze. Ning Shu narrowed his eyes, looking at Liaoning. Intuition told him that he would see this fellow again in the future. Given the entanglement between the original owner of his body and Liaoning, they were originally husband and wife. There shouldn't be no entanglement between them. Liaoning reached out to Ning Shu, as if he could grab her from a distance. Afterwards, she placed her fingers on her lips and lied, gently kissing them, as if she was kissing Ning Shu. Afterwards, Ning Shu smiled. With a flick of his whip, he turned his horse around and galloped away. Seeing Liaoning's actions, Ning Shu's entire body turned cold. He turned around and returned to the princess's residence. After the Mabe diplomatic mission left, Li Wen immediately appointed Shen Feng as the Grand Marshal and directly led the army towards the border. Everyone knew that Ma Bei wouldn't give up so easily. Shen Feng was a general around 40 years old. He was a general who had experienced many battles. No one was surprised by this appointment. However, what they didn't expect was that Li Wen actually appointed Princess Jiehui, Li Xueshan, as the left vanguard. Letting a woman go to war was something that had never happened before. It caused a huge uproar in the imperial court. The waves of opposition came wave after wave. Li Wen only said one sentence to shut these pedantic scholars up. If you don't want Princess Jiehui to go, then you guys can go. It doesn't matter if you guys aren't in the imperial court. Looking at Li Wen's attitude, it seemed like he really wanted to send these weak civil officials to the border. Moreover, he immediately asked them to prepare their things and leave. Then, these people were speechless. After shrinking their necks, they didn't say anything else. After Ning Shu received the imperial edict, he immediately started to prepare his things. All the necessities were prepared. Little Red helped Ning Shu organize a lot of things. She asked, "Princess, are you really going to war?" The imperial edict had already been issued. There were even some fake ones. He bragged too much to Li Wen. Now, it was time to redeem his promise. Ning Shu first went to see Shen Feng. Shen Feng didn't have any special opinions about Ning Shu going to war. He only said that there was no distinction between men and women on the battlefield. Ning Shu said that he would listen to the command. However, Ning Shu didn't expect to see Duan Xinghui. Moreover, he saw Duan Xinghui beside Shen Feng. Ning Shu looked at Duan Xinghui in surprise. Shen Feng explained to Ning Shu, "Duan Xinghui is now my bodyguard. I saw that Duan Xinghui is quite capable. He failed the first time because he didn't have any guidance." Well, the male lead was indeed different. He had nobles helping him wherever he went. Moreover, he had become the bodyguard of the Grand Marshal. His contributions on the battlefield were huge. In addition, he had a strong destiny. Was this guy going to rise again? However, Ning Shu didn't say anything. When it came to the country's major issues, personal issues could be put aside first. "Marshal, you can make the decision." Ning Shu said to Marshal Shen. "Xinghui, send the princess off for me." Shen Feng said to Duan Xinghui. Shen Feng cupped his fist toward Shen Feng and said to Ning Shu, "Princess Jiehui, please." Ning Shu looked at him indifferently and turned to leave. Duan Xinghui followed behind Ning Shu and looked at her long ponytail swinging as she walked. Her posture was elegant and graceful. Seeing that Princess Jiehui didn't say a word to him and ignored him, Duan Xinghui suddenly felt lost. It was undeniable that Princess Jiehui was really outstanding. Thinking that he would be going to the battlefield with Princess Jiehui this time. For some reason, Duan Xinghui's heart actually had a slight expectation. Princess. Duan Xinghui originally wanted to say a few words to Ning Shu, but Ning Shu left the general's residence and directly got on the horse without even looking at him. Duan Xinghui's voice was shattered in the wind. Duan Xinghui was helpless and could only ride back to the Duan residence. Knowing that Duan Xinghui was going to the battlefield, Arya was excited. To be precise, she strongly opposed it. "Duan Lang, did you forget that you were injured last time?" Arya said emotionally, "You were seriously injured last time. Duan Lang, don't go, okay?" Duan Xinghui was helpless and could only say, "I'm a general. I need to stand out. As a soldier, dying on the battlefield is the final destination." Chapter 57. In short, Arya was obsessed with Duan Xinghui and didn't want him to go to the battlefield. First, when Duan Xinghui was rescued by her last time, he was covered in blood and looked like he was going to die, which left a deep impression on Arya. Second, in the capital city, she was closest to Duan Xinghui and had to rely on him alone. If Duan Xinghui left the capital city and left her here alone, Arya felt scared just thinking about it. In this Duan mansion, except for Duan Xinghui, no one else was close to her. They all looked down on her. There was Yuan Dong, who was full of malice to her, and Madame Duan, who hated her very much. Arya became more and more frightened. She looked timid and was no longer as simple and beautiful as before. Under the torture of Madame Duan, no matter what she did, she would think about whether it was against the rules. Sometimes, when she did something wrong, these old maids who taught the rules were very clever in their means of making people suffer. You still can't forget Princess Jiehui, right? When you heard that Princess Jiehui was going to fight, you followed her. How dare you say it's not because of Princess Jiehui? Tears flowed down her face. The tears washed away the rouge on her face. The dark skin covered by the rouge was exposed, forming a distinct ravine. Duan Xinghui closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at Arya with disappointment and said, "It has nothing to do with Princess Jiehui. I don't have the position of general anymore. Now I have to make a contribution. Duan Lang, it's good. You don't have to take risks." Arya sobbed and begged. Duan Xinghui sighed deeply. He was really depressed. Arya didn't know his ambition at all. Was he going to spend his life like this without accomplishing anything? I have to go this time. I have made a military pledge with the marshal. Do you want to see me beheaded? Duan Xinghui was very impatient when he said this. Arya used to be simple, but now it seemed that it was inappropriate. He didn't know what to think about the overall situation. Arya didn't know what he was thinking at all. He wanted to stand up again with his own strength. Going to the battlefield was a very good and quick choice. Wealth came from danger. Looking at Arya's tears, Duan Xinghui's heart was full of helplessness. Princess Jiehui's cold face appeared in his mind. He seemed to have never seen Princess Jiehui cry in front of him. She disdained to cry in front of him. They were both women, but Princess Jiehui could be strong and even go to the battlefield. However, Arya became a daughter flower that clung to him. Duan Xinghui remembered that when he first met Arya, she was bright and innocent. When she smiled at him with wildflowers in her hand, Duan Xinghui only felt that it was the most beautiful thing in the world. But now Arya no longer had the taste of freedom. From Duan Xinghui's point of view, Princess Jiehui, who had always been bound by rules, behaved in a carefree manner. Duan Xinghui felt so tired, especially when he looked at Arya who was crying. A word came to his mind inexplicably, "I don't love you." When Madame Duan heard that her son was going to the battlefield, she agreed very much. If she wanted the Duan family to recover its previous glory, she must make contributions. When she saw Arya's bitter look, she felt as if her son was going to die. Madame Duan gritted her teeth with hatred. She wanted to wait until Duan Xinghui left to deal with Arya. Receiving Madame Duan's gaze, Arya's body trembled. She felt even more bitter in her heart. She looked at Duan Xinghui with sadness in her eyes. However, Duan Xinghui couldn't see it. Duan Xinghui was busy going to the battlefield. Arya felt as if her whole body was soaked in ice water. She couldn't speak of her despair and loneliness. When it was time for the army to go to war, Ning Shu was a little excited. He was wearing armor, which was a little heavy. His hair was cut short and tied into a bun. He wore a helmet and a red cloak fluttered behind him in the wind. Ning Shu looked in front of the bronze mirror and felt great. "Princess, you look like a mighty general." Little Red praised, "You should be the most handsome general." "Little girl, you know how to talk." Ning Shu tapped the tip of Little Red's nose and said, "I'm leaving. Take good care of the princess's residence. I will wait for Princess to come back." Little Red said with a little choked up, "Princess, you must come back safely." Ning Shu looked at Little Red's eager eyes, and a strange thought surged in his heart. Little Red looked like she was sending her husband to the battlefield. Ning Shu immediately turned around and left. Oh, under such eyes, Ning Shu almost fled. Princess, you must come back safely. I will wait for you. Little Red waved her handkerchief and shouted to Ning Shu. Ning Shu almost fell down from the horse's back. He quickly grabbed the reins and galloped towards the army's military field. The entire drill ground was filled with an austere and tranquil atmosphere. Flags fluttered in the wind, and every soldier wore armor and held a red-tasseled spear in their hands. At a glance, they were neat and breathtaking. When Ning Shu saw this scene, it was the first time he had seen the cold and cruel beauty of a cold weapon war. Boundless pride surged in his heart. For the family, for the country, for the people. Ning Shu, under the influence of such an environment, had goosebumps all over his body. Boundless pride rose in his heart. This was his emotion, and it was also the emotion of the original body. Ning Shu urged his horse to Shen Feng's side. Shen Feng was wearing armor and his white beard made him look wise and farsighted. He also had the feeling of a hero past his prime. Ning Shu noticed that beside Shen Feng was Duan Xinghui. It seemed that Shen Feng really thought highly of Duan Xinghui. His armor made him look very wise and mighty. He had sword-like eyebrows and starry eyes. He was filled with the beauty of strength. No wonder the original body was so fond of him. Duan Xinghui, who was sitting on the horse's back, was especially filled with a bewitching beauty. The world's darling was really different. Shen Feng only nodded to Ning Shu. This time was not suitable for talking. Ning Shu only swept a glance at Duan Xinghui and then passed him by. Duan Xinghui originally wanted to say hello to her, but the other party looked at him like a stranger. She did not recognize him at all. This made Duan Xinghui's heart stifled. His anger was mixed with helplessness. Dong, 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 around the military field, there was a deep and penetrating sound of drums. The sound of the drums seemed to beat with the rhythm of the heart. It made people's heart excited. With the arrival of the emperor, Li Wen walked up to the high platform of the military field. Li Wen was wearing a black dragon robe embroidered with golden threads. On his head was the crown of the Son of Heaven. The curtain made of round and plump dragon pearls slightly trembled as he walked. This curtain covered Li Wen's face, but it made him look even more noble. Li Wen had an imposing manner that was proud of the world. When Li Wen appeared, a solemn and dignified atmosphere condensed in the air. People could not help but hold their breath. Seeing Li Wen, the entire military field was filled with the sound of clattering armor. The soldiers neatly knelt on one foot on the ground and shouted, "Long live the Emperor!" Chapter 58. Power gave a man a powerful charm. At this moment, Li Wen was the center of the world. Even Duan Xinghui, the male lead, was inferior in front of Li Wen. Ning Shu saw from the corner of her eye that Duan Xinghui was looking at Emperor Li Wen with envy and confusion. Li Wen raised his voice and said some words to stir up the hearts of the people. His words were impassioned, causing the soldiers below to howl. They wished they could immediately go to the battlefield and kill the enemy. Ning Shu's eyes twitched. Li Wen, who was usually cold and taciturn, could be so passionate when talking about sending people to their deaths. It could be seen that Li Wen was really determined to control the northern desert. Just the amount of food for the army of 200,000 was a shocking number. He wanted to beat the bandits of the northern desert until they were afraid. With Li Wen's full and sonorous voice, the rhythm of the drums became hurried. Mixed with the roars of the soldiers, it shook the entire capital. Jiahui. Li Wen waved his hand to Ning Shu. Ning Shu immediately jumped off the horse and went to Li Wen. He half knelt in front of Li Wen and shouted, "Greetings, brother." Li Wen put the little gray ball on Ning Shu's shoulder. Ning Shu was a little surprised. Li Wen said with his hands behind his back, "This little guy is very sensitive to danger. I tried to feed it some cakes mixed with poison, but it refused to eat. I wanted to throw it into the snake cave, but it ran away. Ning Shu, let it stay by your side, it will be of some use." Li Wen patted Ning Shu's shoulder heavily. It was really heavy. Ning Shu's shoulder was bent. "Come back alive." Ning Shu's nose twitched and he almost cried. It was probably the original owner's emotions. Ning Shu also felt that although Li Wen was cold, he still had some brotherly feelings for the original owner. Ning Shu replied with a nasal voice, "Imperial brother, you should also pay more attention to your body. Your body is everything. Only with a good body can you do a lot of things and fulfill your wish of creating a prosperous era." Li Wen's expression was somewhat complicated as he said, "Go." The little gray ball squeaked and jumped onto Li Wen's body. It was obviously reluctant to let Li Wen go. Its small and sharp claws grabbed Li Wen's clothes and squeaked. Ning Shu was speechless. Li Wen had tormented it like that, but it still couldn't bear to do it. Ning Shu was very unhappy. He walked over and caught the little gray ball. The little gray ball squeaked in Ning Shu's hand. The sound was very sad. It was sad to hear it and shed tears. The army walked towards the gate. Ning Shu sat on his horse and looked at the commoners on both sides of the street sending them off. There were also some family members who looked at their loved ones in the army with tears in their eyes, as well as anticipation and worry. It was tragic and solemn. Ning Shu looked at these scenes and understood more and more why Li Wen wanted to create a prosperous era where the people lived in peace. It was just that this prosperous era had to be constantly fought, even built on blood and bones. It was just to let the world live in peace and happiness. Ning Shu's sharp eyes saw Arya and Madame Duan in the crowd, as well as Yuan Dong. Yuan Dong's head was covered with pearls and jade. She looked exactly like a rich madam, but her expression was very melancholy. Duan Xinghui probably only cared about being entangled with his true love and had neglected Yuan Dong. Duan Xinghui saw his loved ones in the crowd, his mother and his lover. For some reason, Duan Xinghui first glanced at Ning Shu and saw that her face was indifferent, as if she didn't care about anything. Duan Xinghui breathed a sigh of relief in his heart, but it was mixed with an indescribable bitterness and loss. It could only be said that things that couldn't be obtained were good things. In the plot, Jiehui desperately wanted to be with Duan Xinghui, but Duan Xinghui hated her. She was like a dog skin plaster sticking to him. Now that she ignored him, Duan Xinghui felt lost in his heart and all kinds of pretentious mischief arose. Ning Shu only knew how to give Duan Xinghui the middle finger. How could a person be so despicable? After walking for nearly 4 hours, the marching team was completely out of the capital. At this time, the sun had risen very high. It was a little warm on people's bodies, especially when they were wearing armor, which could block the biting cold wind. Looking back, the soldiers following behind were sweaty. Their black faces were somewhat glowing, and hot white smoke came out of their bodies. "Princess, do you want to set up camp?" Shenfeng asked Ning Shu. Ning Shu could see from Shenfeng's expression that he didn't want to set up camp. Speed was the most important thing in war, but Ning Shu asked because of her identity as Princess Jiehui. Ning Shu shook her head and said, "Marshal Shen is the supreme commander. Jiehui should abide by the military rules. Marshal Shen has the final say." They had just left the capital and were about to set up camp. When would they reach the northern region? "Everyone, speed up!" Shenfeng shouted. Once the order was given, the soldiers carrying the flag waved the yellow flag and transmitted the message. Shenfeng no longer had scruples about Ning Shu's identity as a woman. He directly followed the strictest military order and marched until night time before setting up camp. Ning Shu finally breathed a sigh of relief and sat alone in a simple tent. After all, she was a woman, and a princess of a country. There was no reason for her to sleep in the same tent as those men. However, the food was completely the same as ordinary soldiers. Ning Shu was not picky. She ate coarse noodles mixed with meat soup. Only when she was full would she have the strength to fight. Ning Shu felt that she was quite hardworking. In order to complete the mission, she had to put on armor and go to the battlefield. To be honest, Ning Shu's heart was still a little anxious. After leaving the capital, the little gray ball had been very dispirited. It looked at Ning Shu with a pair of depressed eyes. Even when Ning Shu gave half of her food to the little gray ball faced Ning Shu with its butt and looked at the sky with a sad and bright angle. Ning Shu was speechless. It felt so intoxicating. What was this guy doing? Was he so reluctant to part with Li Wen? The little gray ball had a lot more spiritual energy than before. After Ning Shu finished her dinner, she got some water and washed up. After all, she was a woman. It was very inconvenient to be in a group of men. What Ning Shu did not expect was that in the middle of the night, someone had actually snuck into her tent. It seemed that they had bad intentions, and it was not just one person. Ning Shu was so angry that she laughed. Sure enough, women were in a vulnerable position. If something really happened, they could just say that they had died in battle. Ning Shu felt that she needed to make an example of them. Otherwise, there would be some lustful people in the future. Probably because they were afraid of Ning Shu's identity as a princess, these people did not go too far. Moreover, many of these people were middle-ranking generals. Ning Shu felt that there would be a chance to make them swallow their teeth and blood. The next day, when the army was marching, Duan Xinghui rode beside Ning Shu. Ning Shu asked, "Princess, are you okay?" Ning Shu was already in a bad mood. When she heard Duan Xinghui's words, she felt that this guy was gloating. She said coldly, "What does Guard Duan think I'm not okay?" Chapter 59. Duan Xinghui also knew that there were people in the army who were plotting something. With Princess Jiehui in the army, this group of men became restless. Originally, Duan Xinghui was concerned about her and walked over to ask. However, she bluntly retorted, "What do you think will happen to this princess?" This caused Duan Xinghui's heart to stifle. He was very angry. He was only concerned about her. Why was she looking at him with such vigilant eyes? Princess Jiehui's feelings for him had changed too quickly, causing Duan Xinghui to feel that Princess Jiehui's love for him was like a dream. Duan Xinghui was snubbed. He turned his horse around and left, going to ensure Grand Marshal Shenfeng's safety. The army continued to march forward. After such a long time, Ning Shu found it difficult to endure. They had marched for nearly 10 days. During this time, Ning Shu's thighs had been scraped. Left with no other choice, Ning Shu sewed a soft cushion for himself and tied it to his thighs. Finally, the pain lessened. In addition, some of the men in the army became bolder and bolder. Perhaps they were slowly probing Ning Shu's bottom line. Some of them even had a crazy idea, which was to treat Princess Jiehui as a soldier's prostitute. Ning Shu sneered when she found out. Towards those who approached her tent, no matter who they were, she would give them a good beating. As if they had seen Ning Shu's savagery, these men did not dare to wander around in front of Ning Shu's tent. Even if they passed by, they would be beaten. As a result, Ning Shu's tent became a vacuum. Ning Shu was very satisfied with this. These people were truly despicable. Only when they were ruthless to him would they know fear. The further the army advanced, the more desolate it became. Large tracts of land were uncultivated. Even some of the land that had been planted with grain had been ruined beyond recognition. The Xiongnu and Tatars treated the common people of Great Yong's borders as fat sheep. Once their wool grew, they would harvest it. In the winter, when there was no grain, they would harvest it. Ning Shu's heart was filled with indignation. The Xiongnu Tatars were tall and strong, yet instead of working, they only knew how to plunder. Shen Feng's face was also filled with grief. He stroked his somewhat white beard and looked around. He sighed and said, "The people living at the border are really too bitter." Shen Feng had not seen the hardships of the commoners who were captured by the Tatars. Their clothes were ragged, and their faces were yellow and emaciated. They worked for the Tatars, and the Tatars drank wine and whipped the slaves. Ning Shu's heart was in turmoil. He couldn't wait to fight with these despicable Hun people. The closer they got to the border, the heavier the hearts of the soldiers became. The villages here were desolate and there was basically no one to be seen. Moreover, the closer they got to the border, the more serious the desertification became. Shen Feng found a desolate village to set up camp. In this village, there were only some old, weak, sick and disabled people. Children who did not have enough clothes to cover their bodies were so cold that their lips had turned purple. Their bodies were covered with some rotten cotton wool, which was simply not enough to cover their bodies. Seeing the army, the people in the village revealed expressions of horror and despair. Even though these soldiers were not wearing Xiongnu clothing, these people were still afraid. Plucking feathers from wild geese, soldiers passing by like combing a comb. This was why these commoners were so panicked and at a loss. Ning Shu felt sour and said to Shen Feng, "Marshal, it's better if we don't enter the village. It's not suitable to disturb the commoners." Shen Feng saw that these people were so frightened that their bodies were trembling. He ordered them to set up camp not far from the village and ordered them not to disturb the commoners. Ning Shu sat in his tent and took off the soft cushion wrapped around his legs. After such a long march, the saddle had already worn out his thighs. Fortunately, there was still a soft cushion, so it did not worsen. Ning Shu sprinkled some medicinal powder on the reddened areas. Suddenly, his ears twitched. He seemed to have heard a woman's cry for help. Ning Shu quickly came out of the tent. At this time, the sky was a little dark. Ning Shu seemed to have heard the sound of horses' hooves. Ning Shu stepped on the trunk and directly climbed up a tree. He looked into the distance and saw less than 20 Xiongnu Tatars riding horses on a dusty road not far away. They were teasing a woman who was running with all her might in front of them. Each of the men's faces revealed extremely cruel and playful smiles. They had the interest of a cat playing with a mouse. Ning Shu circulated his qi and jumped down the tree. He walked directly to the largest tent. He entered the tent and said to Shen Feng, "Marshal, there are traces of Tatars ahead. I hope that Marshal can send a team of soldiers to this general." When Shen Feng heard this, he asked the general in the tent, "Who is willing to go with the left vanguard?" Princess Jiahui's status was the highest after Shen Feng, and these men were not willing to submit to a woman. Seeing these people's attitude, Ning Shu swung his whip and said, "Come with me. If you don't, I'll whip you to death." First, Duan Xinghui stood out. Shen Feng sent a team of nearly 100 people to Ning Shu and they went in that direction. When they arrived at their destination, Ning Shu saw that these Xiongnu Tatars had actually grabbed the woman and torn her clothes, revealing her white body. A circle of Xiongnu Tatars surrounded the woman. Their unbridled and lewd smiles mixed with the woman's panicked cries and curses. Seeing this scene, Ning Shu's head was about to smoke. He rode over and directly whipped the man who was already on top of the woman. When the man was about to raise his spear, he was suddenly whipped. Moreover, it was on his back. He immediately felt pain in his body. Then, he felt his body go numb. Ning Shu's whip directly injured the man's spine. For a moment, he was unable to move. Everyone was shocked by this sudden situation. They stared blankly at the person who had injured the man with the whip. Their eyes were filled with amazement and fear. Ning Shu took advantage of the fact that no one was paying attention. He directly straddled the horse's back, bent down, grabbed the woman's arm, and pulled her up onto the horse's back. The woman stared blankly at Ning Shu. She seemed to have fallen into Ning Shu's cold eyes. When the Tatars saw that their spoils of war had been snatched away, they cried out in anger. At the border, the Xiongnu Tatars had always been successful. They had never encountered such a situation. Ning Shu took off the red cloak on her back and covered the woman's body. Until now, the woman didn't seem to have reacted. When the cloak covered her body, the woman's body trembled. She lowered her head and didn't speak. After a while, the group behind them caught up. When Duan Xinghui saw the Xiongnu Tatars in front of him, his eyes blazed with hatred. Last time, he had fallen into the trap of these Tatars, causing him to lose his position as general. At first, the Tatars angrily spoke in a language that Ning Shu could not understand. Now that so many people had arrived, one of the Tatars stammered in Great Yong's language, "You are not border guards." The border guards of Great Yong were all intimidated by them. When they saw them, they would take a detour. This was why the Tatars were able to act so recklessly on Great Yong territory. Chapter 60. Ning Shu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the Tatars in front of him. On Great Yong's territory, they had harmed Great Yong's citizens and raped Great Yong's women. These bandits were so arrogant that Ning Shu was so angry that he laughed, especially when he heard one of the Tatars say something about quickly releasing the woman. "Give that woman to me. You Great Yong men are even more beautiful than women." A drooling expression appeared on the Tatar's face. Ning Shu had not opened his mouth to speak. In addition, he was wearing a helmet. For a moment it was impossible to tell that Ning Shu was a woman. Looking at him, one could tell that he was an extremely beautiful man. Before Ning Shu could say anything, Duan Xinghui, who was next to her, shouted, "Impudent thing! Capture all of these people alive!" Ning Shu's voice was clear and cold, but it made the Tatars on the opposite side tremble all over. Their faces showed an expression of extreme enjoyment, as if they had been doused with a bucket of ice water in the hottest days of summer. Looking at Ning Shu, their eyes shone, and their saliva was about to flow out. A woman, and an extremely beautiful woman. When the woman in Ning Shu's embrace heard Ning Shu's voice, she blankly turned her head to look at Ning Shu, her eyes shining. Ning Shu looked at these Tatars. They had so many people here, yet they were so fearless. He was so angry that he laughed, "Capture all of these bastards for this prince. If this prince doesn't whip these sluts until they call her mother, then she will be unworthy of this prince's title." Duan Xinghui took the lead, and the troops behind him charged forward to fight. Ning Shu looked at the chaotic scene. These Tatars were indeed brave. There were more than 100 people here against less than 20 Tatars, and there were even some who were injured. TSK. Ning Shu felt very vexed as he watched. Even though the Tatars relied on their physical advantage, they were unable to withstand the large number of people. In a short while, they were captured. However, there was no fear on their faces, and their mouths were still cursing. Ning Shu also felt drunk. He swung his hand and whipped the fiercest Tatar. Moreover, he whipped him in the face. Ah! In an instant, blood spurted out from the Tatar's face, and even his eyeballs were blinded. The Tatar covered his face and rolled on the ground in pain. The Han people who had been cursing suddenly stopped. They looked at Ning Shu with unruly eyes, but they stopped cursing. "Take these people away," Ning Shu said coldly. However, these Tatars believed that Ning Shu did not dare to kill them. Immediately, they began to jump up and down. Ning Shu shouted, "Great Yong's cowards! Hurry up and release us. Otherwise, when the time comes, you'll have a good time." The soldiers at the border didn't dare to kill them. They were even more afraid of the revenge of the northern desert cavalry. This was why the Tatars were so fearless even after being captured. Duan Xinghui frowned as he looked at Ning Shu. Ning Shu whispered, "Princess, if this continues, it will be a blow to the morale of the soldiers." Ning Shu looked at Duan Xinghui with disdain, especially when he saw that Duan Xinghui was about to whisper into his ear. Ning Shu coldly said, "If you want to talk, then talk. Why are you getting so close?" This sentence sounds familiar. Wasn't this the catchphrase of the school doctor in the previous world? How did she learn it? Duan Xinghui's face was both red and white. For a moment, he was speechless. Ning Shu surveyed the soldiers of the Great Yong dynasty. Just a moment ago, they had fought with 20 Tatters and appeared dispirited. Some of them even had injuries. Ning Shu felt extremely vexed when he saw this. He swung his whip, causing it to crack. Especially now that it was winter, it was extremely painful to whip someone. Seeing the whip in Ning Shu's hand, the Tatters involuntarily took a step back. Even the Great Yong soldiers holding the Xiongnu captive took a step back, afraid of being accidentally injured. Ning Shu tilted his head, seeming somewhat puzzled as he looked at the Tatters. Puzzled, he asked, "Who are you going to use as monkeys?" Ning Shu looked at the woman sitting in front of him. Even now, her body was still trembling. In order to flaunt his power over a woman, Ning Shu whipped the Xiongnu closest to him. Moreover, he whipped the Xiongnu in the lower part of the road. Ning Shu dared to guarantee that with this whip, the Tatar would have nothing left. The Tatar who was whipped let out an inhuman cry, lying on the ground and howling in grief. Ning Shu's whip did not stop. Ning Shu clenched her teeth, her body trembling slightly. This was the first time she had killed someone. Moreover, she had to kill someone. This was not only to intimidate the Tatters, but also to intimidate the generals and soldiers of Great Yong. If she truly became weak, not to mention the Tatters, even the men of Great Yong would try to kill her. The final outcome would be even more miserable. Being treated as a soldier to vent his lust, the heavens were high and the emperor was far away. At this time, her status as a princess did not have any deterrence. Ning Shu used all her strength. The Tatar who had been whipped had already stopped breathing. Every time he was whipped by Ning Shu, his body would twitch. His lower part had already been whipped into a bloody mess by Ning Shu. Seeing all of this, Ning Shu's stomach churned. She wanted to vomit, but Ning Shu resisted. Ning Shu looked around at the Tatters. When they met Ning Shu's gaze, the Tatters lowered their heads in fear. Ning Shu then looked at the soldiers in her position. When Ning Shu's gaze swept over them, the soldiers reflexively covered their crotches. "Tidy them up. Looking at them affects my mood too much. Once I am in a bad mood." Ning Shu's voice was extremely cold. Immediately, soldiers came over to tidy up the Tatters who had been whipped until they no longer resembled humans. Everyone looked at Ning Shu with fear in their eyes. Ning Shu knew that she was no longer the same. Her hands were already stained with blood. Perhaps in the future, the world would not lack slaughter and blood. Ning Shu could only strengthen her heart. Everything she did must be worthy of her heart. Duan Xinghui also looked at Ning Shu with a complicated expression. Especially when he saw her cold and indifferent eyes and the bloody whip in her hand. She looked cruel and evil. Duan Xinghui only felt his heart beating violently in his chest. He couldn't tell what he was feeling. But there was one person who looked at Ning Shu with a different expression. Her eyes were shining with worship and deep envy. Ning Shu looked at her eyes and smiled. She asked aloud, "Do you dare to kill the Tatters? Kill the Tatters who humiliated you just now? Do you dare?" Ning Shu said indifferently, but it made people's hearts tighten. The woman's bronze face was filled with determination and hatred as she said, "The hatred between me and the Tatters is as deep as the sea. The Tatters killed my family. I want to kill the Tatters to avenge my family." The woman took the whip from Ning Shu's hand and walked over to the Tatters who had whipped Ning Shu and was on top of the woman. The Tatter's face trembled and bared his teeth at the woman. The woman used Ning Shu's red cloak to cover her naked body and then waved the whip at the Tatars. Chapter 61. In the end, the Tatar was whipped to death by the woman. Perhaps it was because Ning Shu had set a bad example, or because the woman hated the Tatar who had violated her to the bone, but the first lash of the whip was aimed at the Tatar's crotch. This was a man's weakest spot. Being whipped meant losing half of one's life. Here, other than Ning Shu, all the men felt a chill in their crotches. Looking at the mangled Tatar below, even the soldiers of the great Yong dynasty felt a chill run down their spines. After the Tatar died, the woman suddenly burst into tears. Her cries were heart-wrenching as she called for her father and mother. Immediately wiping away her tears, she walked in front of Ning Shu and knelt down with a plop. Raising the whip with both hands, she presented it to Ning Shu. However, because of this action, the cloak on her body could not cover her body, revealing her naked body. However, these men all lowered their heads in unison, not daring to look. What had happened just now had shattered the courage of these men. Ning Shu took the whip and looked at the woman in front of him. Her skin had the characteristics of the borderlands. It was somewhat dark, but her hair was very thick. She could not be considered beautiful, but her thick eyebrows gave her an unswerving determination. "General, let me follow General and go into battle to kill the Tatar." Ning Shu pleaded. "I already have no place to go. The Tatar killed my family and destroyed my home." Ning Shu extended his hand and pulled her onto his horse. He asked, "What is your name?" "You will follow by my side." "I, your servant, commoner, lowly one." The woman did not know how to address herself. Her face was both black and red. "You can directly address me as your servant. In the future, you will follow by my side. You can address me as princess." Ning Shu actually wanted to have a woman by his side. It was quite convenient. "Princess." The woman looked at Ning Shu in shock. She clearly did not expect that a princess of a country would come to the borderlands to fight. "Princess, please bestow a name. Your servant's life is given by princess." Ning Shu spoke sonorously and forcefully. Her voice was extremely solemn and firm. A smile appeared on Ning Shu's face. Who said that women were inferior to men? Perhaps they were inferior to men in terms of physical strength, but don't underestimate a woman's tenacity. "From today onwards, you will follow me. You will be named Kai Sang." Ning Shu was quite happy. She finally had her own team, even though she was only one person. However, it belonged to her completely. Just now, when she wanted to bring people here, no one paid any attention to her. These men still looked down on women, even if she was a princess. Women were women, they should stay at home and nurse their children. The battlefield was for men to play. Kai Sang was very respectful to Ning Shu. She went to the side to put on her clothes and did not sit with Ning Shu. Instead, she led the horse for Ning Shu. "Take these Tatars back and interrogate them properly." "They should be spies," Ning Shu said indifferently with a cold face. He had to pretend to be cool to the end. Actually, pretending to be cool wasn't easy at all. Ning Shu turned his horse around, preparing to return to the camp. The sound of hoofbeats could be heard from not far away. Moreover, there were quite a few people. Ning Shu's heart froze. He immediately said to Duan Xinghui, "Quickly release the signal flare." Duan Xinghui immediately pulled the trigger, causing the signal flare to explode in the air. After a short while, a group of Tatar cavalry arrived. They were extremely imposing. Their horses were fat and strong, and they kicked up a large cloud of dust. Just this imposing manner was enough to cause the people of Great Yong to panic. Even the troops panicked, their faces revealing expressions of fear and uneasiness. Ning Shu shouted, "What are you panicking for? Stand properly for me." Regardless of how a battle was fought, the troops had to be orderly and imposing. Ning Shu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the leader of the Tatars. It could only be said that enemies often cross paths. At the very front of the Tatars was the second prince, Helian Ing. Second prince, second prince. Seeing Helian Ing, the captured Tatars immediately shouted excitedly. Then, they looked at Ning Shu with complacency and resentment in their eyes. Ning Shu lashed out with his whip, producing an ear-piercing explosive sound. It formed an afterimage, immediately silencing the Tatars. They felt as if they were fighting against each other. Seeing Princess Jiahui intimidate the Tatars with a single whip, the soldiers of Great Yong puffed out their chests, looking rather imposing. Helian Ing was wearing animal leather, revealing some of his chest. He looked even wilder than when he was in the capital. His entire body was brimming with a bewitching wildness. Helian Ing first looked at the scout on the ground who had been whipped until he no longer had a human shape. A dark and gloomy expression flashed across his eyes. Then, he looked at the armored Ning Shu. You shouldn't have done this. Helian Ying's tone was very languid, but it was also very dangerous. You didn't want to marry me for peace, and now you want to lead troops into battle. Princess Jiahui, you have truly exceeded my expectations. Only a woman like you is worthy of this prince. Helian Ing extended his hand, grabbing in Ning Shu's direction. Ning Shu smiled wickedly. Just obediently marry me for peace. There is no need to cause trouble here. You killed my warriors of the northern desert. Let your Great Yong soldiers pay for it. If I kill one warrior, this prince will slaughter 100 soldiers and 100 commoners. If I kill 2, this prince will slaughter 500 soldiers. Helian Ing bared his teeth, his eyes flickering with a cold luster. Helian Ying's voice, mixed with the cold wind, reached everyone's ears, causing them to shiver involuntarily. Princess Jiahui, come with this prince. Helian Ing looked at Ning Shu. If you come with me, I will release this group of people. Princess, let this general go and fight. Duan Xinghui's expression was unsightly as Ning Shu pleaded. Withdraw. Ning Shu reprimanded. Duan Xinghui's face was filled with unwillingness as he looked at the languid yet extremely dangerous Helian Ing. Are you saying that you want to come with me? A smile appeared on Helian Ying's face, his expression somewhat joyous. Ning Shu extended his hand. You are the first woman that this prince has admired, and also the woman that is most worthy of this prince. Ning Shu wanted to vomit in this man's face. So cool. Does he really think that he is so great? Ning Shu sneered. With a flick of his whip, he lashed out at the lower part of a Tatar captive. The Tatar captive was whipped to death. Ning Shu's movements were too fast. Even Helian Ing was stunned for a moment. He immediately gripped the reins tightly, looking at Ning Shu with a malicious expression. Princess Jiahui, do not attempt to infuriate this prince. The soldiers of Great Yong all looked at Ning Shu in astonishment, feeling as if they were looking up at a lofty mountain. Ning Shu ignored Helian Ying's unsightly expression, saying, This is the fate of those who humiliate the women of Great Yong. This prince will whip every single one of them to death, especially you bandits who steal Great Yong's provisions and prey on Great Yong's people. If this prince does not whip these human-faced animals to death, then this prince is not Great Yong's princess. Lacking propriety, righteousness, integrity, and shame. This prince would rather die than marry into Great Yong. Helian Ing, who do you think you are to make this prince follow you? Chapter 62. Do you people of the northern desert not even have a bronze mirror? Why don't you take a look at yourselves? Without a bronze mirror, take a piss and look at your own reflection. Do you really think that you are the best in the world? Ning Shu scolded with great pleasure. Every time he saw Helian Ying's expression, as if it was his honor to have taken a fancy to him, Ning Shu felt his balls ache. He looked like an idiot. After being scolded by Ning Shu, these burly Tatar men felt their blood boil. Each of them stared at Ning Shu with wide eyes, wishing that they could eat Ning Shu alive. Ning Shu sneered, but his mind was filled with curses. What the hell was Shen Feng doing? Why hadn't he come after such a long time? He was only a few steps away. Ning Shu's heart sank. If he didn't deal with these people when he returned alive, there would be many more such incidents in the future. He Lianing didn't even care about her image, cursing like a shrew on the streets. She had painstakingly created the image of a noble and elegant princess. Hearing Ning Shu's abuse, He Lianing's face revealed a sullen and cruel expression. In a cold voice, he said, "Princess Jiehui, you are trying to infuriate me. Do you not care about the soldiers behind you?" Ning Shu sneered. "Of course, I can't do anything about it. Even if I were to die, it would be me who dies in front of them." "He Lianing, aren't you being too arrogant to act recklessly in Great Yong's territory?" Ning Shu only knew how to argue. He had no advantage in fighting. Moreover, it was cavalry against infantry. He would be killed in an instant. "Princess Jiehui, it is not that this prince is arrogant, nor is it that our warriors of the northern desert are arrogant. It is that your Great Yong soldiers are cowards, not daring to face the warriors of the northern desert. You don't have the slightest bit of courage. For such a country, this prince can only hee your sister." Ning Shu cursed inwardly. He Lianing's words caused the citizens of Great Yong to feel extreme humiliation. They looked at He Lianing with bloodshot eyes. "Princess, this general requests permission to fight," Ning Shu said in a deep voice, his tone sonorous. Ning Shu was speechless. Could he win in this situation? Could it be that all wars are fought alone? "Are you going to fight alone?" Ning Shu and Duan Xinghui asked in a low voice. Duan Xinghui watched as Ning Shu leaned over to talk to him. For some reason, Duan Xinghui's heart began to thump violently. He puffed out his chest and said, "Let me fight the enemy's general first." Fuck, was it really a one-on-one fight before a group fight? He Lianing saw that Ning Shu was chatting with a man without looking at the situation. He Lianing shouted coldly, "Princess Jiehui. What are you shouting for? Can't you see that we're discussing something?" Ning Shu said snappily. He Lianing was speechless. He Lianing raised his head. The Tatar cavalry behind him immediately surrounded Ning Shu's group. The Great Yong soldiers stood back to back, raising their red-tasseled spears and waiting solemnly. Ning Shu's expression chilled as he looked at He Lianing. He Lianing sat leisurely on his horse. Looking at Ning Shu, a pleased smile appeared on his face. "Princess Jiehui, have you thought it through? Those who are engaged will be my wife, those who run will be my concubine. He Lianing, you want me to go with you? What is my status?" Ning Shu had no choice but to feign civility with He Lianing. "Princess." Duan Xinghui couldn't help but shout. Ning Shu ignored Duan Xinghui. Shen Feng still hadn't come. Haha, he really didn't place her, the princess, in his eyes. "Of course you are this prince's consort. This prince's lands, cattle, sheep, and slaves are all yours." He Lianing's voice was filled with temptation. Ning Shu really wanted to spit at He Lianing's face. She didn't have anything in Great Yong. Why would she need He Lianing's things? Her fief was even more than He Lianing's. "He Lianing, this consort has always wanted to fight with you. If you want this consort to leave with you, you'll have to see if you have the ability." Ning Shu sneered, "Tell your people not to move. The two of us will fight." Ning Shu knew that this battle had to be fought. It wasn't only for the sake of morale, but also to make this body no longer fear He Lianing. Seeing He Lianing, this body reflexively trembled. Ning Shu clenched his teeth. From the bottom of his heart, he felt that He Lianing wasn't undefeatable. In the future, he would fight with He Lianing many times. Could it be that he would tremble every time? Touching the whip at his waist, Ning Shu looked at He Lianing. Let's fight one-on-one. He Lianing looked at Ning Shu with a very tolerant gaze, as if she was looking at a naughty pet. She extended her claws, wanting to scratch him. As you wish. If you lose, will you have to go with this prince? He Lianing's lips curled into a smile. This prince is very interested in you. Ning Shu lashed out with his whip, clamping the horse's belly. With a coquettish snort, he galloped towards He Lianing. Ning Shu used all his strength to lash out with his whip. He Lianing ducked and dodged. Ning Shu had to control his trembling body while fighting with He Lianing. He Lianing originally wanted to tease Ning Shu. However, seeing Ning Shu's grave expression, she showed no mercy. He Lianing's heart also became cautious. She drew out the broadsword at her waist, blocking Ning Shu's sharp whip. Duan Xinghui watched from the side, very worried. His lips were tightly closed, his gaze following He Lianing's figure. Especially when he saw He Lianing's sparkling eyes looking at Princess Jiehui, Duan Xinghui felt very uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. He Lianing laughed heartily. Her voice was low and sexy, carrying a swift and fierce aura with it. She wrapped Ning Shu's whip around her saber, grabbed Ning Shu's whip, and pulled Ning Shu in front of her. Ning Shu was speechless. Feeling the hand around her waist, she felt very disgusted. It was as if a caterpillar had landed on her skin. Ning Shu struggled with all her might, but she couldn't break free. Moreover, her nose was filled with a wild smell. Let go of this princess. Ning Shu coldly rebuked. He Lianing met her clear and cold gaze. It was clear and cold, like a snow lotus swaying in the wind on a snowy mountain. Dishonest little wild cat. He Lianing said in a low voice, tightly hugging Ning Shu's waist. Fuck, did she have to disgust people to death? He Lianing, this slut, was definitely the biggest obstacle to her completing this mission. You damned Tatar, let go of Princess Jiehui. Duan Xinghui shouted. His expression was anxious and unsightly. He Lianing didn't pay any attention to Duan Xinghui. Instead, she looked at Ning Shu. Ning Shu sneered and raised her leg to kick He Lianing's lower part. He Lianing's legs clamped down on Ning Shu's legs, making it so that Ning Shu couldn't move. Then, she lowered her head to look at her colorful face. He Lianing looked meaningfully at Ning Shu. Fuck, Ning Shu's embarrassment turned into anger. The heavens gave men strong bodies, but they used this strength on women. What kind of morality was this? He Lianing was using strength to crush her. Ning Shu took a deep breath. She was someone who had practiced exceptional martial arts. Ning Shu used all her strength to raise her knee and kick He Lianing's lower part. Chapter 63. Ning Shu originally wanted to give He Lianing a kick that would end her descendants. However, He Lianing quickly dodged, while Ning Shu broke free from He Lianing's control. Taking advantage of the situation, he lashed out with his whip at He Lianing's body. Caught off guard, He Lianing was struck by the tail of the whip. Immediately, she felt a burning pain on her arm. He Lianing's complexion changed, turning pale. Even her forehead broke out in a cold sweat. Ning Shu mounted his horse. Seeing He Lianing's appearance, he could not help but proudly ask, "How does it feel? Does it feel like you're in ecstasy?" This prince's whip has been soaked in chilly water and added a strong ingredient. How does it feel? Moreover, you have already been poisoned. He Lianing's handsome eyebrows creased, her face twitching. Afterwards, Ning Shu smiled, revealing his sinister teeth. This prince likes this style. Ning Shu's eyelids twitched. This He Lianing was truly perverted. Even in this state, she could still chat cheerfully and wittily with him. Second prince. Hearing Ning Shu say that the whip was poisoned, the people behind He Lianing became very worried. They looked at Ning Shu with sinister eyes. Despicable woman from Great Yong. These Tatters had the nerve to call her shameless. No matter how shameless she was, she could not be more shameless than these Tatters who burned, killed, and pillaged. How could these rats be qualified to call others shameless? Helianing ignored the worries of her subordinates. Instead, she faced Ning Shu, licking her lips with her tongue. Bewitchingly and wildly, she commanded, other than Jiahui, kill everyone else. Yes, Ning Shu's face darkened. In a deep voice, he commanded, officers and soldiers, the Tatters have trampled on our territory, bullying and humiliating our wives and daughters. We must drive these bandits out of our territory. We must defend the country and protect our wives and daughters. Defend the country and protect the country. A low and solemn voice resounded through the forest. The soldiers' faces were solemn and determined to die. Seeing Princess Jiahui raise her whip, everyone felt hot blood rush to their hearts. Helianing looked at Ning Shu maliciously. Do you really think that these people can defeat this prince's cavalry? Jiahui, come with this prince. This prince will give you unparalleled glory. You will be this prince's woman in this lifetime, the only woman. Helian Ying's hand was stained with blood. Ning Shu stretched out his hand, and the blood on his hand dripped into the dust. It looked cruel and enchanting. Ning Shu sneered. Facing the Tatar cavalry charging towards her, she threw out her whip and wrapped it around the Tatar's neck. The Tatar's neck was immediately dripping with blood. After struggling for a while, he stopped breathing. Helianing, this princess is Great Yong's princess. This princess glory will be given by Great Yong. Even if this princess were to die, this princess will die on Great Yong's soil. You want this princess to leave with you? Keep dreaming. Ning Shu berated. Helianing shook her head. She looked at Ning Shu with treacherous eyes and said, I like you the way you are. You seem to be wilder than the women of the northern desert. Ning Shu thought, this slut thinks too highly of herself. The sounds of weapons colliding, blood spurting, and swords piercing bodies could be heard. Ning Shu clenched his teeth. Out of the corner of his eye, he could even see the Tatar horses trampling over the corpses of Great Yong soldiers, shattering their bones. An indescribable grief and hatred welled up in Ning Shu's heart. Facing the charging Tatar cavalry, she lashed out with her whip. The barbs dug into the Tatar cavalry's face and even into their eyes. When she pulled her whip out, she even pulled out her eyeballs. Giddy up, giddy up. Finally, the sound of hooves could be heard from the distance. They had been waiting for reinforcements all this time, but only now had they arrived. A Great Yong general led his troops over. Seeing the ground littered with corpses, he repeatedly said, against the Tatars. Helianing didn't bring a lot of cavalry. Faced with so many people, Helianing looked at Ning Shu, whose face was covered in blood and only her bright eyes could be seen. Helianing then said to her subordinates, come back. The Tatar cavalry immediately retreated behind Helianing, solemnly awaiting Great Yong's arrival. Ning Shu touched the fresh blood on his face. The thick smell of blood assaulted his nose, making him feel nauseous. Ning Shu did not dare to be careless. He looked at Helianing, the hand holding the whip trembling slightly. Helianing smiled leisurely at Ning Shu. He was clearly injured, but other than his face being pale, he did not seem to feel any pain. Truly ruthless, so ruthless even to herself. Helianing pointed at the captured Tatars and indifferently said, release the warriors of the northern desert. Ning Shu was so angry that he laughed. What kind of situation was this? He could not help but say, so what if I don't release them? No matter how powerful your northern desert cavalry is, my Great Yong will use 10 lives to exchange for a single northern desert Tatar. If 10 is not enough, then we will use 100. Helian Ying's pupils constricted. She suddenly laughed, looking at Ning Shu with eyes that grew brighter and brighter. Finally, she smiled. This smile actually contained a trace of admiration. Liaoning extended her finger and rubbed the sand on her lips. It is hard to imagine that in this bustling, befuddled place, there would still be such a backbone. Even Great Yong's border guards do not dare to speak to this prince like this. Jiahui, you should not have been born in Great Yong. Instead, you should have been a woman galloping through the grasslands. Ning Shu sneered. In order to not be married to you, I can pay any price. Now, Ning Shu did not know if this mission could be completed. When countries collided with each other, an individual was truly too insignificant. She had to break away from this man for the original owner of her body. Now, it seemed that the power of the plot was too great. She had broken away from the marriage, but Liaoning, this man, had actually pestered her. Men were all cheap. If they could not be obtained, then they were good. The original owner of her body had been incomparably cruel to her during the marriage. Now, she actually wanted her to leave with him. This was simply trampling on Great Yong's and Li Wen's faces. Liaoning's actions were more likely to strike a blow to Great Yong's morale. Imagining her own country's princess disregarding etiquette, justice, integrity, and shame and running away with the enemy's prince, especially when she was previously the subject of a marriage alliance, it was simply a huge joke. She would go down in infamy for 10,000 years. Ning Shu sneered, a place where the monarch is neither monarch nor subject, where the father is neither father nor son, where there are no 3 cardinal principles and 5 cardinal principles. How can this incomparably corrupt northern desert be a place where this prince, a person as pure as ice and as pure as jade, can stay? Liaoning, scram back to wherever you came from. Die. Liaoning's face grew paler and paler. Hearing Ning Shu's words, she spat out a mouthful of blood. Of course, how could someone as thick-skinned as Liaoning be so angered by Ning Shu to vomit blood? Instead, the poison had flared up. You really poisoned me. Liaoning wiped the black blood from the corner of her mouth. Ning Shu spread out his hands innocently. This prince is an honest person. I never lie. Liaoning's gaze scanned Ning Shu's face, scraping it inch by inch. Then, she smiled ostentatiously. Princess Jiahui, you should prepare to be pestered by this prince for the rest of your life. This prince is so scared. Ning Shu patted his chest. This prince likes to see you scratching your heart and lungs but unable to obtain this prince. Go. Liaoning spat out another mouthful of blood, ordering the northern desert cavalry. Chapter 64. Liaoning turned her horse around and prepared to leave, no longer caring about the captured Tartars. Ning Shu sneered. Great Yong's territory is not a place where you can come and go as you please. Ning Shu took the bow and arrow. Circulating his chi, he pulled the bowstring into the shape of a full moon. The arrowhead flickered with a cold luster as it aimed at Liaoning's back. Ning Shu loosened her grip and the arrow flew towards Liaoning with a whistling sound. Liaoning dodged Ning Shu's bow and arrow by lying on the horse's back. The bow and arrow pierced through the tree trunk with a ding sound. Liaoning looked at the arrow in the tree trunk and could not help but turn her head to glance at Ning Shu. She sat coolly on the back of her horse, her eyes cold and full of killing intent. Ning Shu was somewhat disappointed that he had not disposed of Liaoning. Sure enough, she had been a scourge for 1,000 years. If Liaoning had died so easily, it would have been unrealistic. In short, the original owner of his body and Liaoning were entangled. In his previous life, they had been fated to be husband and wife. How could fate be so easily severed? Sorting out his thoughts, Ning Shu turned his head and coldly said, "Clean up the battlefield. Register the dead soldiers and reward them according to their merits. Give their families 3 times the compensation." Ning Shu looked at the corpses on the ground. Some had been trampled beyond recognition by the horses. Some had even been split in 2. Their internal organs and intestines were still steaming. The dust had been dyed black by the blood, and the thick stench of blood made one dizzy. War was cruel. War was cruel. The corners of Ning Shu's eyes were a little hot. She sneered and looked at the late general. When he met Ning Shu's eyes, the general was stunned and then looked away. He cupped his fist and said to Ning Shu, "Princess, where are the Tatters?" The heads of the Tatters can be exchanged for military merits. The general's eyes lit up as he looked at the Tatters. Even though they had arrived late, they still wanted to snatch the credit. Shen Qingqing felt extremely displeased with Great Yong's officers and soldiers. No wonder the Tatters were so unbridled in their territory. Why didn't they spend their energy fighting the Tatters? Shen Qingqing looked at him and said coldly, "Whoever dares to touch these Tatters, I will cripple him." "What, do you want the credit?" "This general does not dare." The general hurriedly lowered his head. Ning Shu was not only a princess, but also the left vanguard. Her status was higher than his. The man's heart was filled with displeasure and grievance. Ning Shu didn't care what these people thought. He shouted, "Return to the camp." Kai Sang, who was saved by Ning Shu, was leading the horse. She looked at Ning Shu with sparkling eyes. When they returned to the camp, Ning Shu directly ordered his men to escort nearly 20 Tatters to the high platform of the drill ground in the middle of the camp. Perhaps they had become accustomed to being unbridled on Great Yong's borders. Although they were afraid when faced with the pitch-black soldiers below, they were certain that Great Yong's soldiers would not dare to kill them. Their expressions were filled with provocation. Ning Shu first knelt on one knee and saluted to Shen Feng in the tent. Then he reported the situation. In addition, he recounted how the general had arrived late and disregarded the life and death of his comrades. The general's face immediately darkened. He looked at Ning Shu with eyes filled with deep-seated resentment. Ning Shu sneered and stroked the whip at his waist. How could he fight when the hearts of his soldiers were so divided? He had to concentrate his efforts in one direction. There were bound to be rats and rats. Ning Shu had to establish his prestige. He couldn't allow these self-righteous men to look down on him because of his status as a woman. He had to kill the chicken to warn the monkey. The chicken was precisely these Tatters. Ning Shu ignored the general's resentful gaze and walked onto the high platform. In a cold and loud voice, he said, "The Tatters hurt my compatriots. Kill. The Tatters trampled on my land. Kill, kill. Kill." The soldiers below all raised their spears and shouted loudly. The dozen or so Tatters on the high platform were shaken and their faces turned pale. Especially when they saw Ning Shu coming over with a whip in her hand, they were scared out of their wits and started mumbling something that no one could understand. Ning Shu sneered and lashed out at the crotch of a Tatar. The Tatar, who had been tied up tightly, rolled his eyes in pain, his mouth emitting inhuman screams. The soldiers, who had been shouting their slogans with lofty aspirations, were so shocked that they lost their voices. For a moment, the drill ground filled with 200,000 soldiers was silent, all of them covering their crotches. Ning Shu sneered, "This is the price for humiliating my Great Yong's women." Ning Shu lashed out with the whip, continuously lashing out at the Tatter's crotch until it was dripping with blood and badly mangled flesh. Ning Shu surveyed the entire drill ground. Every man who was swept by Ning Shu's gaze felt their scalps tingle. They looked at Ning Shu as if they were looking at a demoness. Kai Sang stood below the platform, looking at Ning Shu, her eyes revealing an intoxicated expression. In the end, the dozen or so Tatters had their testicles popped by Ning Shu. They couldn't be more dead. Even Shen Feng, who had fought for half his life, had never seen anyone humiliate the enemy like Ning Shu. "Princess, that's enough. The army must pay attention to benevolence and righteousness. What is the difference between our Great Yong and the bloodthirsty northern desert?" Shen Feng asked Ning Shu. Ning Shu looked at Shen Feng, whose beard was somewhat white, and said, "Marshal, Jia does not agree with your words. Our benevolence and righteousness are seen as weak and easy to bully by our enemies. They will only look down on us even more. Only by using violence to curb violence and killing to stop killing can we intimidate our enemies. Since I can't reform you, I'll fucking cremate you." Shen Feng couldn't convince Ning Shu, and Ning Shu didn't agree with what Shen Feng said about benevolence and righteousness. Ning Shu beckoned to Kai Sang, who immediately ran in front of Ning Shu. Kai Sang asked, "Princess, what are your orders?" "Go and find some butchers." "Yes." Kai Sang went to find some butchers. Ning Shu directly ordered them to empty their stomachs. The butchers were immediately scared to the point of wetting their pants. They were butchers, not humans. Not only were the butchers scared to the point of wetting their pants, even the soldiers below felt their hair stand on end. Looking at the indifferent Ning Shu, they felt both admiration and fear. Finally, the butchers dissected the Tatters. Ning Shu had the bodies of the Tatters smeared with salt before hanging them at the city gate. In the dead of winter, it was the perfect time to make bacon. Ning Shu's actions intimidated everyone. Shen Feng looked at Ning Shu and shook his head. Ning Shu loudly declared, "This is the price for invading my great Yong." The rows of corpses hanging at the city gate allowed the bold and fearless Tatters to see that these people, who had been wantonly trampled upon by them, were still able to resist. For a long time, the corpses were hung on the city walls. After being exposed to the elements, the corpses became even stiffer, causing the Tatters passing by the city gate to tremble in fear. Such brutality! Ning Shu didn't pay attention to these people's fearful gazes. Afterwards, Princess Jia Hui's reputation as a demoness quietly spread. If they had any thoughts before, then now they wished they could arm themselves to the crotch of their pants. The sight of Princess Jia Hui's pants made them shiver. When Ning Shu returned to his tent, his entire body went limp and he nearly vomited. However, his body felt incomparably carefree. Ning Shu guessed that this was the original owner of his body. Princess Jia Hui hated the Tatters. During the marriage alliance, she had been humiliated by the Tatters. Now that she saw these people fall to such a state, she felt incomparably carefree. Ning Shu also smiled. To be able to do something for the original owner of his body was extremely good. Chapter 65. After this matter, Ning Shu had established absolute prestige in the army. Of course, they were afraid. Ning Shu expressed that he did not care. What surprised Ning Shu was that Kai Sang actually followed him to learn martial arts. Every day, other than washing clothes, cooking, and serving Ning Shu, she also took time to practice martial arts. She said that she wanted to go to the battlefield to kill enemies. Ning Shu also allowed her to do so. It was unknown whether it was because Ning Shu's reputation was too brutal, but there were many lonely and helpless women who had been defiled by the Tatters who ran over to seek refuge with Ning Shu. It did not take long for hundreds of people to gather. They had become a female army, adding a touch of color to the entire military camp. These women were all desperate and had no choice but to seek refuge with Ning Shu. Seeing Ning Shu say that he wanted to go to the battlefield to take revenge, they gnashed their teeth in anger. Ning Shu thought about it. It was very important to establish a team that he could command. Thus, he accepted these women and had people teach them the basics of martial arts. Perhaps it was because they had found a new goal in life. These women were no less vicious than the men. Perhaps women could not compare to men in terms of physical strength, but men could not compare to women in terms of tenacity. However, the military camp could not raise these women for nothing. Even Shen Feng vaguely said that women could not stay in the military camp. Ning Shu did not say anything. He only said that these women helped in the military camp. For example, cooking and sewing clothes were all done by these women. In the end, Shen Feng could only let Ning Shu do as he wished. With Ning Shu as a precedent, it was not easy to use the reason that women could not stay in the military camp. Ning Shu did not know that a wave of criticism had already been set off in the capital. It was nothing more than that his methods were too brutal. Another thing was that he had taken in so many women in the military camp, which touched the nerves of these pedantic scholars. If women could go to the battlefield, how could the 3 obedience and 4 virtues be used to restrain women in the future? It would not be good to add shackles to women's thoughts. The officials all rose up. Li Wen sat on the dragon throne. His face was expressionless, but a hint of a smile flashed in his eyes. He read the memorials from the border repeatedly. When he saw Ning Shu's actions, a hint of satisfaction flashed in his eyes. Then, he looked at the ministers below and said indifferently, "Yes, your methods are cruel. How about this, I will send one of you to the border. If you can come back alive, I will dismiss Princess Jiehui. How about that?" The officials were speechless. The emperor wanted them to die. When facing these officials, Li Wen's attitude was always indifferent. If one of them died, someone would immediately replace him. Li Wen wished that these corrupt officials were all dead. The ministers shrunk their necks and lowered their presence. Not long after, Ning Shu received a letter from Li Wen. There were only 2 words written on it, "Very good." Ning Shu immediately understood Li Wen's meaning. It seemed that Li Wen approved of his actions. With Li Wen's support, Ning Shu's heart felt more at ease. Now, Ning Shu's tent had become a forbidden area for men and a base for women. The women wore armor and waved red tasseled spears. They actually looked decent. Ning Shu's lips curled into a smile. This could be considered as the power left for the original owner. He hoped that after she left this world, the original owner would be able to live a more relaxed life. Ning Shu was now walking on the majestic city wall. He looked at the Tatars' corpses on the wall. Looking up, he saw a vast grassland and snow mountains in the distance. It was such a magnificent scene. Ning Shu was followed by the armored Kai Sang. Ning Shu said, "Princess, the people of the northern desert have such a vast land. Why do they still want to steal our things? Stealing is addictive. It is easy to reap without sowing. Farming is not something the Tatars can do." Ning Shu said indifferently. Probably because Helianing was injured, there were no Tatars harassing the border recently. Ning Shu practiced martial arts every day and also thought of a way to deal with the Tatars' cavalry. The Tatars' cavalry was the most powerful. The horses and people were fat and strong. He had to think of a way to deal with the cavalry. If 100 people were exchanged for 1 Tatar from the northern desert, Ning Shu's heart would tremble. It was simply stacking human lives. There would be a way. Ning Shu wandered on the city wall and bumped into Duan Xinghui. Duan Xinghui walked up. Ning Shu cupped his fist and said, "Greetings, princess." Ning Shu grunted coldly and brushed past Duan Xinghui. Duan Xinghui saw that Princess Jiehui did not even look at him. He could not help but say, "Princess Jiehui, will you go with the second prince of the northern desert?" Ning Shu stopped and turned around to look at Duan Xinghui with a frown. "Guard Duan, this doesn't seem to have anything to do with you. Also, it's not up to you to question the relationship between me and Mo Bei's second prince. If you spread this kind of rumor in the army, be careful that I don't kill you." Duan Xinghui bowed slightly. Ning Shu said, "I will remember." Ning Shu snorted and returned to the camp with Kai Sang. The Tatars only focused on raiding. The infantry had no advantage over the cavalry. Snow fell from the sky like goose feathers. In less than a day, the snow covered everything. Shen Feng looked very dignified. Usually, in this kind of weather, even cattle and sheep would freeze to death. Now was the time for the Tatars to raid. They sent soldiers everywhere to scout and sent a lot of soldiers to guard. Ning Shu still did not think of a way to deal with the cavalry. The most effective method was to use crossbows to shoot the Tatars on horseback. Shen Feng was not young. He did not have much confidence in winning the battle. He only wanted to do meritorious service and not make any mistakes. However, Ning Shu wanted to deal a heavy blow to the Tatars. He suggested that Shen Feng put large crossbows on the city wall. Shen Feng nodded at Ning Shu's suggestion and went to arrange it. Duan Xinghui had been by Shen Feng's side. He was busy. Now that the battle was coming, Duan Xinghui could not help but comfort Ning Shu. "Princess, in fact, as long as we defend the city wall, we will win." Ning Shu was quite speechless. What did Duan Xinghui mean by saying this to her? Ning Shu was also preparing for the battle. "Princess, let us go with you this time." Ning Shu pleaded with Kai Sang. "They all want to go with you." When Ning Shu came out of the tent, she saw the female army standing neatly in front of her. They weren't very beautiful, they didn't even have enchanting figures, but their aura couldn't even be compared to men. Their expression was solemn. When they saw Ning Shu, they knelt on one knee on the ground. "Greetings, Generals Wu Qianfeng." Ning Shu was instantly filled with lofty sentiments. He shouted, "Get up. There will be a great battle soon. Are you afraid?" "Not afraid." The woman's voice was not as deep as the man's voice. Mixed together, it was very clear and moving. "From now on, start training archery. Archery is about arm strength. To deal with the Tatars, crossbows are the best way. Start training now." Ning Shu pointed at the target. "Shoot at the target." Ning Shu was the first to pull the bow and arrow. She directly shot at the target. Her strength was very big. She directly shot through the target. Chapter 66. Ning Shu hoped that these poor women who sought refuge with him could survive. At this time, they must train hard. Only then would they have a chance to survive on the battlefield. Sure enough, after the heavy snow stopped, Helianing led the Tatars to attack the city. Ning Shu stood on the city wall and met Helian Ying's eyes. Ning Shu was very angry. Why didn't this guy die? Was it because the poison was not deep enough? Didn't he vomit blood? Now he was alive and kicking. Helianing was wearing fur. His neck was furry. Obviously, he was wild and noble. He raised his head and looked at Ning Shu. Ning Shu smiled coldly. He waved his hand and ordered the soldiers to carry the ladders to attack the city. The war drum sounded. Ning Shu shouted coldly, "Release the arrows." Suddenly, a rain of arrows flew towards the Tatars. The Tatars who were attacking the city were hit by several arrows. Some of them even became hedgehogs. "Shoot again." The soldiers who were shooting arrows at the back immediately replaced the soldiers in front. Ning Shu saw many women being hit by arrows from the corner of his eyes. Ning Shu's heart trembled. Then, he calmed his mind. Change to the catapults. This catapult should be considered a weapon with great destructive power in ancient times, especially when shot from a high place. Some of the Tatars climbed up the city wall with great difficulty. However, they were hit by ice and fell down from the ladders. They could not move. Helianing looked at the snow-covered objects on the city wall. He had a guess in his heart. He suddenly looked at Ning Shu. Ning Shu smiled. "Yes, it is as you think. These are the corpses of the Tatars." The Tatars hanging on the city wall revealed their dark eye sockets. The eyeballs inside were already gone. They were pecked away by birds. Either do not do it, or do it to the extreme. Helian Ying's complexion suddenly became very unsightly. She looked at Ning Shu with eyes that carried dense killing intent and treacherous entanglement. Her expression was incomparably dangerous. Ning Shu stretched out his hand and handed her a crossbow. Ning Shu pointed the arrowhead at He Lianing. He Lianing sneered at Ning Shu from a distance and pointed her bow at Ning Shu. Whoosh, whoosh, the two arrows whizzed through the air, even creating tiny sparks in the air. Ning Shu's pupils dilated as she looked at the arrow flying towards her. Ning Shu tilted her head, but the arrowhead still grazed her face. The wound was very small. "Princess, are you all right?" When Duan Xinghui saw this scene, he was so scared that his heart almost stopped. He finished off the Tatters who had already climbed up the wall with one slash and Ning Shu ran over. Ning Shu smiled evilly as he wiped the blood off his face. He even stuck out his tongue and licked the blood on his fingertips. He did not pay attention to Mu Jinyu, but looked closely at He Lianing. Duan Xinghui looked at Princess Jia Hui who had an evil smile on her face and only felt his heart beating violently in his chest. The current Princess Jia Hui was incomparably charming. The bloodstains on her face even added a cruel and fatal beauty to her. Looking at He Lianing sitting on the horse, Ning Shu was disappointed, but it was still within his expectations. If He Lianing died so easily, Ning Shu would simply burn incense to the high heavens. In the end, the Tatters did not succeed in this siege. When the Tatters fled, their formation was scattered and panicked like fish that escaped the net. Ning Shu grabbed He Lianing from a distance and then kissed her lips. Then, she turned her horse around and ran away. Ning Shu pursed his lips. This was the most annoying thing about the Tatters. If they could not win, they would run away. Fighting with them required a lot of energy. Ning Shu was very angry. He pulled his bow into the shape of a full moon and the arrowhead rushed towards He Lianing's back. "Princess, He Lianing is very crafty. He is deliberately running away. If Princess chases after him, you will fall into his trap. Cavalry is suitable for fighting on the plains." Duan Xinghui looked at Ning Shu's unwilling expression and could not help but persuade him. "You are a precedent for failure. I will not foolishly chase after you," Ning Shu said to Duan Xinghui. Then, he shouted loudly, "Clean up the dead soldiers and register them." Duan Xinghui was speechless. Duan Xinghui felt that his good intentions were treated as ill intent. Furthermore, Princess Jia Hui tore open his wounds like this, making him feel embarrassed and a little sad. Right now, Princess Jia Hui completely regarded him as an enemy. It was not appropriate to call him an enemy. He had no power or influence. She had never considered his feelings when she spoke. What made Ning Shu sad was that half of the more than 100 women were now dead. Yesterday, they were still alive. Today, they had become corpses. There was not even anyone to collect their corpses. Ning Shu asked Kai Sang to bury these corpses and register their names. They were women, but they were also heroes. They should not be deprived of the praise they deserved because of their identity. They should be left in the history books. The expressions of the surviving women became more determined. Even though their faces were very pale now, their eyes were very determined. In the following time, the Tatters seemed to be tireless in attacking the city. Ning Shu could even see that He Lianing's face was anxious. It was probably because of the heavy snow and the army did not have any provisions. Also, the winter provisions of the entire northern desert were obtained by plundering. Now, they could not even break through the city wall. He Lianing looked at Ning Shu who was standing on the city wall. This year, because of this princess, they would not let them in even if they died. In the past, the guards would symbolically guard the city. Then, when they were defeated, they would let them in to plunder and then return to the northern desert. Princess Jiehui, Li Xueshan, this woman, Ning Shu also felt a lot better in his heart. He looked almost numbly at the soldiers being carried away. However, so many people had already died. They could not give up. If they compromised this time, then there would be a next time, and a next time. Would these people die in vain? There was another more important reason. That was, if they lost, these hateful Tattars would enter the hinterland and plunder everything. At that time, the northern desert would propose a marriage alliance, which would also disappoint Li Wen. Therefore, they had to hold on. During this period, because Duan Xinghui had made a lot of contributions, he was directly promoted to the right vanguard by Shenfeng. He was almost on the same level as Ning Shu. He was indeed the world's favorite. With luck on his body, he was like a fish in water in this kind of war. How lucky was he? Ning Shu clearly saw the arrow whistling towards Duan Xinghui, but the one who was shot was the soldier beside Duan Xinghui. Ning Shu was speechless at that time. He did not know what Shenfeng liked about Duan Xinghui. Shenfeng praised him so much that Duan Xinghui, who was still a soldier, became the third person in the military camp. Now, Duan Xinghui was qualified to command the battlefield. He stood beside Ning Shu and looked at He Lianing with gnashing teeth. Ning Shu's nerves had been tense all this time. Especially when he saw that her female troops had casualties, Ning Shu's heart ached. However, as time went by, the casualties were getting smaller and smaller. These women's bodies were full of valiant qi. They were not worse than men. These remaining were all good seedlings. He Lianing retreated again. Before she retreated, she looked at Ning Shu with cruel and excited eyes. This made Duan Xinghui, who was standing beside Ning Shu, feel very uncomfortable. Chapter 67. He Lianing seemed to be at odds with Ning Shu. Other than when it was snowing or raining, he would attack the city. It was as if he was doing the 8th set of radio calisthenics. However, blood flowed like a river. Ning Shu simply wanted to curse. He stood on the city wall and looked down at that bastard He Lianing. This battle was all about money and food. Just a day's worth of food was a terrifying number. He didn't know how long he could last. Moreover, Ning Shu looked at Grand Marshal Shenfeng's attitude. It seemed that he didn't want to persist. However, if he didn't persist, so many lives and so much investment would be wasted. He could only drag it on like this. Ning Shu received another letter from Li Wen. It was a private letter for him. Li Wen's meaning in the letter was very clear. Although he hoped that Ning Shu could win the battle, he hoped that Ning Shu could persist and have a strong attitude. At the end of the letter, there were some words of concern. It sounded a little like an elder brother. As for how much sincerity there was, Ning Shu didn't want to delve into it. As an emperor, every action and every word had a deep meaning. Today, the weather was very good. After a day of wind and snow, the ground was covered with a thick layer of snow. Ning Shu originally thought that with such bad weather, it would be difficult to even walk and that He Lianing wouldn't attack the city. He didn't expect that he would still attack the city. Moreover, the Tattars' faces were filled with anxiety and desperation. It was now late winter. However, there was no harvest this year. Even the calm He Lianing frowned. His expression was very cold. He raised his head and squinted at Ning Shu, who was standing beside the flag. The bright and beautiful sun shone on her body. Her armor emitted a cold light. It was so dazzling that even Princess Jia Hui's face couldn't be seen clearly. Duan Xinghui stood beside Ning Shu. Seeing that He Lianing kept looking at Princess Jia, he felt very uncomfortable. He couldn't help but say to Ning Shu, "Princess, the Tattars of the northern desert are ambitious. Princess, you must not compromise." Ning Shu couldn't help but want to dig out her earwax. She basically heard these words every day. It seemed that Duan Xinghui was a man of few words. In front of the original Princess Jia, he always had the appearance of a cool brother. Now that he was nagging, it was really annoying. He Lianing pursed her lips and looked at the couple on the city wall. She couldn't help but shoot at Duan Xinghui with her bow and arrow. She didn't know if it was because of the strong wind today, but the arrow that was flying towards Duan Xinghui was actually shot towards Ning Shu. Ning Shu, as expected, the unlucky ones who stayed with Nan Zhujun would always be cannon fodder. Ning Shu wanted to dodge, but her body suddenly lost control, and her soul seemed to be ejected out of her body. Ning Shu was shocked. What was going on? Why did she suddenly lose control of her body? Duan Xinghui saw the arrow speeding towards Princess Jiehui. Furthermore, Princess Jiehui still had a blank expression, not knowing how to dodge. Panic surged in Duan Xinghui's heart. He hurriedly used his saber to slash at the arrow. However, the arrowhead still shot towards Ning Shu. The arrowhead lost its aim and pierced into Ning Shu's shoulder. Ning Shu groaned. The sound of the arrowhead piercing through flesh rang out in her ears. Immediately after, an earth-shattering pain engulfed her entire brain. Damn, it's so painful. Ding! Counterattack mission completed. Do you wish to leave this world? A cold mechanical voice sounded out in Ning Shu's mind. Yes, yes, yes. Ning Shu only wanted to quickly leave this world. It was too painful. Even if she wanted to leave this world, she didn't have to stab herself with an arrow. The system tricked me. In an instant, Ning Shu's soul left Princess Jiehui's body. Everything happened too quickly. By the time everyone reacted, they realized that a great Yong commander had been killed. The northern desert Tattars beat their chests and cheered, their morale soaring. They looked at their second prince, Helianing, with gazes of worship and reverence. As for Helianing, who was viewed as a hero, he tightly gripped his bow, trembling slightly. His face was pale and his eyes trembled. She could have clearly dodged. With her strength, she shouldn't have been unable to dodge this arrow. Furthermore, the person he wanted to kill wasn't her. Helianing raised his hand and loudly shouted, "Beat the gongs and retreat." This, now was clearly the best time to attack the city. Why did they have to retreat? Second Prince, right now is the time when Great Yong's morale is at its lowest. Attacking the city now is twice the result with half the effort. Why do we have to retreat? A Tatar commander asked Helianing. Slap. Helianing slapped the commander's face. Gnashing his teeth, he said, "This prince said to retreat, so we will retreat." Helianing turned his horse around and glanced back at Princess Jiehui's position. There was no one there. In a daze, he saw a pair of clear and cold eyes, aloof yet filled with disdain and craftiness. She shouldn't die so easily. Carrying Princess Jiehui, Duan Xinghui rushed to the military doctor's tent and loudly shouted, "Save her, quickly save her." Duan Xinghui waited outside the tent, anxiously pacing back and forth. Right now, Duan Xinghui was anxious, fearful, and terrified. He also had an intense desire to not let Princess Jiehui die. However, when he thought that this woman who looked down on him would die, Duan Xinghui's heart felt like it was in a pot of oil. When the arrow was pulled out, Princess Jiehui let out a muffled groan. She opened her eyes slightly and looked at the simple and crude tent. How was she still alive? She was still in the Tatar tent of the northern desert. Pain assaulted her, and Princess Jiehui fainted. Seeing that Princess Jiehui was fine, everyone in the military camp breathed a sigh of relief, especially Shenfeng. Although swords and sabers had no eyes on the battlefield, the death of a country's princess, who was of the same mother as the emperor, didn't matter how many meritorious deeds he had performed. The emperor wouldn't care. However, Princess Jiehui felt as if she was in a dream. She didn't know if she had seen her previous life before being shot by the arrow, or if the current situation was just a dream. Looking at the women kneeling before her, their expressions were solemn and respectful. When they saw her, their eyes were bloodshot. Touching the whip in her eye, Princess Jiehui smiled. No matter what, she was no longer as miserable as she was in her dream. She wasn't humiliated by others, and she wasn't in the pain of living in the ceaseless pain. She didn't disappoint her imperial brother. She was the most honorable princess of the great Yong dynasty. When she saw Duan Xinghui, Princess Jihui smiled. This man, whom she had loved so much in her dream, was currently looking at her with a worried expression. So what if she was a woman? Women weren't necessarily inferior to men. She was willing to remain unmarried for the rest of her life and fight for her imperial brother for the rest of her life. No matter how painful it was, it couldn't compare to being shared by many men, eating pig's food, living a life that was neither human nor ghost, living without dignity, not knowing why she lived. Even if it was like a dream, this dream was so real. Princess, are you all right? Finally, Duan Xinghui stepped forward and asked. Under the princess' meaningful and strange gaze, he asked Princess Jihui. Princess Jihui stared blankly for a moment. It seemed that she hadn't heard Duan Xinghui's voice for a long time. Chapter 68. As if to ascertain whether Princess Jihui was truly all right, He Lianing soon arrived to attack the city. Seeing Princess Jihui standing on the city walls, he laughed. He Lianing laughed. She laughed very happily. Princess Jihui looked at He Lianing. This man, this demon-like man, could actually laugh like this. A cruel and treacherous man would never laugh like this. What was he laughing about? Could it be that seeing that she had not died, he was so disappointed that he had lost his mind? Princess Jihui touched the whip at her waist, coldly snorting, "Shoot the arrows." Duan Xinghui looked at her. The current Princess Jihui was even more noble and proud, as if she had been reborn. The current Princess Jihui did not have her previous cold demeanor, appearing even more luxurious. As she pursed her lips, her temperament became different. Duan Xinghui was confused by the ever-changing Princess Jihui. Previously, Princess Jihui had looked at him with extreme coldness. When she looked at him, it was as if she knew his secret thoughts, her eyes filled with mockery and disdain. The current Princess Jihui looked at him with treacherous eyes, with a hint of rejoicing and even more relief. Immediately after, she looked at him as if he was a stranger. Duan Xinghui was speechless. Duan Xinghui felt as if his heart was being torn apart. Looking at Princess Jihui's back, he felt as if he had lost something important. His heart suddenly felt empty, so empty that it was unbearable. This battle continued until the beginning of spring. When the snow melted, He Lianing led the remaining soldiers back to the grasslands. Before leaving, he looked at Princess Jihui with a treacherous gaze. Princess Jihui sneered. She was no longer the pitiful woman in her dreams. She would forever be Great Yong's most noble Princess Jihui. After returning to court, when she saw Li Wen, tears welled up in Princess Jihui's eyes. In this world, only she and her imperial brother were family. Li Wen looked at Princess Jihui with gratification. After a while, he said, "You've changed again." Ah. Princess Jihui did not understand. Li Wen decreed that Princess Jihui could be buried in the imperial mausoleum 100 years later and enjoy the pleasures of the world. This was an enormous honor. No other princess had ever received such honor. Although the princess was the emperor's younger sister, she was still a woman. After marrying, she would belong to another family. This kind of honor caused all the court officials to grumble. Li Wen didn't say anything and directly sent the ministers who strongly opposed to the idea to the border to guard it. He enjoyed the bustling life in the capital, and it was easy for him to talk. He also went to the border to guard it. Next, it was time to award Duan Xinghui according to his contributions. Li Wen looked at Princess Jihui. Princess Jihui said indifferently, "Just award him according to his contributions. Royal brother, you don't have to worry about me." When Duan Xinghui learned that he had been promoted to level 2 Agile Cavalry General, he felt very complicated. Looking at Princess Jihui who was sitting in front of the palace, Duan Xinghui felt even more complicated. Duan Xinghui returned to the Duan residence at the speed of a tortoise. He did not feel the slightest bit of urgency in his heart. His mood was abnormally heavy. It was undeniable that he was very regretful. The gate of the Duan mansion was unusually lively. Duan Xinghui, dressed in armor, returned in glory. Madame Duan looked at her son and cried tears of joy. She said with heartache that he had become darker and thinner. Duan Xinghui's eyes swept over Yuan Dong and finally rested on Area. She was wearing a lake blue silk dress with a hairpin in her hair. She looked happy and showed her teeth. But then she realized that it was inappropriate and quickly pursed her lips. Area quickly showed Duan Xinghui a smile without showing her teeth. But she didn't know that such a smile made her look very timid and even self-abased. In just one winter, Area no longer had the freedom, simplicity, and beauty that Duan Xinghui saw. Now Area's every move was so awkward, like a puppet. Duan Xinghui saw the smile on her face, and the face of Princess Jiehui appeared in his mind. She could even stick out her tongue to lick the blood at the corner of her mouth. She looked evil and charming, which was breathtaking. Area was very excited that Duan Xinghui married her. At the banquet, Duan Xinghui drank a lot and even shed tears. Maybe he was mourning, or maybe he was regretting. Duan Xinghui and Area's life was not so good. Duan Xinghui gave Area the position of his wife, but he didn't fulfill the promise of being with her for the rest of his life. He had other women around him. Without Princess Jiehui, Duan Xinghui didn't care about other women or how many women he had. There was no happiness in his life. Area was not reconciled, but she had to endure it. She had to endure the man rolling with other women. Her heart was full of holes. Right now, Princess Jiehui had become the bright moonlight in Duan Xinghui's heart. What he couldn't obtain was the best. Duan Xinghui would never be able to obtain Princess Jiehui in this lifetime. Princess Jiehui had become a celestial concubine. After the war, an envoy from the northern desert came and said that they were willing to sign a treaty of non-aggression for 100 years. But there was one condition, which was to let Princess Jiehui marry the second prince of the northern desert, Helian Ing. Princess Jiehui smiled. She would rather die than enter the northern desert. This time, before Princess Jiehui said anything, Li Wen objected. After the envoy from the northern desert left, Princess Jiehui told Li Wen that she was willing to guard the border. She was even willing to stay unmarried for the rest of her life to resist the Tattars of the northern desert. Princess Jiehui said frankly that no man in this world was worthy of her. Li Wen joked, "If you meet a man as excellent as my royal brother, you won't marry him?" Princess Jiehui smiled, "There is only one person like my royal brother in this world. There is no other." Duan Xinghui was in the hall when he heard Princess Jiehui say this. He remembered that Princess Jiehui said a long time ago that he was the best man in the world. Now, Princess Jiehui couldn't see his figure in her eyes. Princess Jiehui traveled through the night and returned to the border. Leading her female soldiers, she patrolled the city walls. She saw a row of Tattars' corpses hanging on the city walls. Without the ice and snow covering them, the Tattars' corpses revealed their original appearance. They revealed sinister and painful expressions as they turned into dried corpses. Kai Sang said to Princess Jiehui, "Now, the Tattars don't dare to look at these corpses. The Tattars who come to the city to trade don't dare to be arrogant. The commoners here all call the princess the goddess of war. They even say that they want to erect a plaque and statue of the goddess of war." Princess Jiehui smiled and didn't say anything. However, not long after, an enormous stone statue was erected in the city. It was a statue of Princess Jiehui dressed in armor. Her hair was raised high and swayed in the wind. Her eyes were proud and noble, and a whip hung from her waist. Looking at this enormous statue, tears streamed down Princess Jiehui's face. She was Great Yong's noble princess, the revered Princess Jiehui, not a filthy princess. Chapter 69. When Ning Shu returned to the system space, she couldn't help but touch her shoulder. Even now, she still felt pain. After being a normal person for so long, Ning Shu hadn't been in so much pain for a long time. Only when undergoing chemotherapy would it be so painful. Ning Shu almost forgot that she was once a patient. Looking down at her body, Ning Shu sighed. Her soul dimmed a little. She quickly sat down and absorbed the energy of the system space. Ning Shu thought of the peerless martial art. She simply followed the route of the peerless martial art. This speed was too slow. Ning Shu thought of the peerless martial arts mental cultivation method. She didn't know if it would work. She was now a soul. Without a body or meridians, how could she use the mental cultivation method? She felt drunk. Ning Shu sat on the ground with her eyes closed. She didn't know what material it was, but what made Ning Shu surprised was that the speed was faster. Moreover, the material felt very comfortable when it was introduced into her soul. It was a cool feeling. Ning Shu was in the middle of doing it when a cold mechanical voice sounded in the system space. Congratulations player for returning. Do you want to see the information page now? Yes. Ning Shu had just answered when a screen appeared in front of her. On it was her information. Number, 23333 Name, Ning Shu Age, 27 Experience, 7,100, 7,000/10,000, Soul, 60 HP, 50 Wisdom, 80 Charm, 1 Luck, 25 Mental Strength, 120 Martial Strength, 10 Aptitude, 24 Merit, 2 Skills, 5th Ring Spear Technique, Trash Fighting Technique, Beginner Peerless Martial Art Honorary Title. Goddess of War. Ning Shu saw the title Goddess of War and was stunned. When did she have such a title? And it was a goddess? Forget it, this wasn't the main point. The main point was that she only had 3,000 points this time. Including the peerless martial art she had exchanged for, she only had a total of 7,100 points. There were also 2 merit points that she didn't know what to do with. She fought a bloody battle. She didn't know if the blood on her body was her menstrual blood or the blood of her enemies. In the end, she only got these few points. Alright, it was already good enough to have points. Being able to come back alive was already good enough. You've obtained 5 additional attribute points. Where do you want to add them? The space system asked. Ning Shu clicked on the screen. First, she clicked on the luck stat. Moreover, she was filled with grief and indignation. She realized that her luck was really bad. She was about to leave this world, but she still got shot by an arrow. It was so painful. After Ning Shu finished distributing the attributes, the screen changed. Serial number, 23333 Name, Ning Shu Age, 27 EXP, 7,100, 7,000/10,000, Soul Value, 60 HP, 50 Wisdom, 80 Charm, 1 Luck, 25, +3, Spiritual Power, 120 Combat Power, 10 Aptitude, 24, +2, Merit, 2 Skills, 5th Ring Spear Technique, Trash Fighting Technique, Trash Entry Level Peerless Martial Arts. Honorary Title, Goddess of War. Do you want to enter the mission world? The mechanical voice of the system sounded. Ning Shu shook her head. I'll enter the world later. Her soul had been consumed by the previous world and had already become dim. Moreover, she had experienced slaughter in the previous world. She had changed from a good citizen to a general with blood-stained hands. She had to settle her emotions. If she didn't continue like this, she would go crazy. Ning Shu emptied her thoughts. She was only herself. She was Ning Shu. No matter what she had experienced, she was still herself. She might have lived for others, but she was still Ning Shu. Ning Shu didn't realize that her soul had become heavier. Her expression was relaxed and her eyes were closed. She seemed to be enjoying it. After an unknown amount of time, Ning Shu opened her eyes and looked down at her body. She felt that her soul was much more solid than before. She had to get enough points to get some secret cultivation manuals. Only then could she cultivate more effectively. I'm ready. I can enter the world. Ning Shu said. As soon as she said that, Ning Shu immediately felt dizzy. Fuck, it's always like this. Will it kill you to remind me? I'll give the system a bad review and scram. Perhaps it was because her soul had become stronger, Ning Shu didn't feel as uncomfortable as before when she was conscious. Instead, there were noises in her ears. You're an adult. Why are you being so calculative with a child? A cold and clear voice said. Besides, Dabao didn't do it on purpose. Why are you acting like this? Su Ran, look at yourself. Son-in-law, you're wrong to say that. Ran, just lost her child. It's all because of that little bitch Su Meng's child. How can that child be justified in pushing someone? A sorrowful female voice sounded. At this moment, the male voice sounded angry. I don't want to hear anything bad about Su Meng from your mouth. You, Ning Shu heard these words and struggled to open her eyes. Ran you're awake. A woman looked at Ning Shu with concern. Her eyes were filled with tears. Ning Shu nodded and moved his body. Then, he felt waves down there. His stomach hurt as if a knife was scraping it. Ning Shu was stunned. What was going on? Don't move. Don't move if you're not feeling well. The woman pressed down on Ning Shu's body. Ning Shu looked around. The smell of disinfectant lingered around his nose. It seemed like he was in a hospital. His eyes stopped not far from the bed. Ning Shu saw a man in a black suit. He was tall and straight. The suit looked very sexy on him. His expression was cold and handsome. He was in a black and white suit. His facial features were clear and handsome. His expression and eyes were cold. His entire body was filled with a domineering and handsome aura. He was a very charming man. But now, this man was staring at him with an unfriendly gaze. It was mixed with extreme disgust. It was as if he was some kind of enemy. Ning Shu blinked. She hadn't received the plot yet and didn't know what was going on. So, she kept quiet. The man looked at Ning Shu's pretentious attitude and sneered. He picked up the jacket on the sofa and left. The man's attitude made the woman who was comforting Ning Shu very angry. She looked at the man's back and was so angry that her body trembled. Then, she turned her head and looked at Ning Shu. She said sadly, Ran my daughter. Ning Shu was very uncomfortable. Her stomach hurt. It couldn't be what she was thinking, right? I'm tired. Ning Shu said. She had to accept the plot first. Then rest well. You're in confinement. Don't think too much. Rest well and we'll talk about other things. Mrs. Su said to Ning Shu. Ning Shu was dumbfounded. No wonder her stomach hurt so much. She had a miscarriage. She was an unmarried woman, yet she had skipped so many procedures. Now she had to go through a miscarriage and give birth to a child. Mrs. Su saw her daughter's strange expression and thought she was sad about the child. She quickly said, Mom won't talk about it. Rest well. Mrs. Su wiped her tears. Mom will go back and make chicken soup for you. Chapter 70. After Mrs. Su left, Ning Shu endured the discomfort in his stomach and flipped over. Then, the lochia burst out. Ning Shu felt that life was full of evil. Why was it that every time she entered the world, she would either be beaten to death or starve to death? Now, she had a miscarriage. She decided to add all her attribute points to her luck. Was her luck really that bad? What a scam. Ning Shu closed his eyes and began to accept the plot. However, This plot made Ning Shu feel like he was suffering from menstrual cramps and pain in the balls. This plot was very simple. It was a story of sleeping in the wrong bed, running away with the balls, and finally a happy family. Ning Shu's body was called Su Ran. She was the female lead, Su Meng's cousin, but they were rivals in love. At the beginning of the plot, Su Meng's parents died in a car accident. Moreover, this accident seemed to be a plot by this body's parents. One had to know that the fights between rich families were always so tragic. At the funeral, Su Meng accused her uncle of being the murderer of her parents. However, there was no evidence. Su Meng, who was depressed and in pain, ran to the bar to drink. She thought about how her beloved parents had left her and she was an orphan. However, she couldn't take revenge. Su Meng drank more and more. In the end, she was spotted by a young man in the bar. Su Meng grew up in a rich family. She knew this man's intention. However, her body was weak and she was brought to a hotel by the young man. Su Meng took the opportunity to escape into a room. This room was Nan Zhujuan's room. Please don't ask why the male lead was in this room. Also, please don't ask why Nan Zhujun didn't stay in her own villa and insisted on staying in a hotel. Ning Shu didn't know either. Things were just so coincidental. After tearing at each other for a while, the two of them finally slept together. Lightning struck the earth, causing the earth to shake and the mountains to shake. When Nan Zhujun woke up the next morning, Xiao Yan saw that there was no one beside him. However, there was a note beside the bed with 1,000 yuan. It said that it was for him to spend the night. Xiao Yan was furious. He already had a physiological reaction in the morning. Looking at the money and the words on the note, Nan Zhujun almost shot out of anger. Then he swore to find that hateful woman, blah, blah. Don't ask why a person with a hangover would wake up earlier than a normal person. Ning Shu could only say that perhaps Xiao Yan was too tired and used up too much energy. Speaking of which, Su Meng acted as if she was suffering from paranoia. She felt that her uncle was going to get rid of her, so she quickly bought a plane ticket and left the country. Then, Xiao Yan, who was in the country, almost turned the ground upside down, but he still couldn't find that woman. Su Meng, who was overseas, found out that she was pregnant. Thinking that she had no relatives, and that this child was a gift from God, Su Meng decided to give birth to it. Then, she was very lucky and gave birth to a pair of twins. These two children were very cute, had high IQ, and could earn money. They were so sensible and well-behaved that they didn't seem like children. As the eldest brother, not only did he have to take care of his younger sister, he also had to take care of his adorable mother sometimes. Xiao Yan couldn't find Su Meng, so he followed his parents' advice and married Su Ran, who was Su Meng's cousin. 7 years later, Su Meng returned to China and returned to her hometown with the two children. Under the influence of Su Debao, Xiao Yan and Su Meng met. Xiao Yan recognized this woman at a glance, and when he saw the two children beside her, his heart beat even more fiercely. Su Meng, however, knew that this man had become her cousin-in-law, and she was even more disdainful of Xiao Yan. Even if she was a single mother, there were many pursuers around her, and there were even men waiting silently by her side. When the original owner learned that her husband had such a big illegitimate child with her cousin, she felt bad. She and Xiao Yan had been married for almost 5 years, but they still didn't have any children. The relationship between the older generation was not good, and the relationship between Su Meng and Su Ran was even worse. Now, Su Meng was obviously going to steal her husband, especially when Su Meng had an expression of, "I don't like your husband, take care of your husband," which made Su Ran hate her even more. Since she looked down on him, why did she always flirt with him? Xiao Yan, on the other hand, was deeply in love with Su Meng, and they had a pair of lovely children. This pair of children made the whole Xiao family obedient, especially the two elders of the Xiao family. The original owner, Su Ran, had been married for so many years without children, so she treated the two children very well. Not long ago, Su Ran found out that she was 2 months pregnant, which almost made Su Ran cry with joy. But not long after, she was pushed down the stairs by Dabao, who was 6 years old. Su Ran was lying in a pool of blood. She heard Dabao naughtily say that he didn't do it on purpose. This ant wanted to push him, and he let her go, and then the ant fell down the stairs. Xiao Yan actually said that this was what he should do, and that his son was very smart. The pain in her body couldn't be compared to the pain in her heart. How was this a cute baby? This was simply a naughty child with the naivety and cruelty of a child. How could such a smart Dabao not understand the consequences? He could make money, had a high IQ, and was also a top hacker. The male lead should be Dabao, who was simply a cheat. After Ning Shu accepted the plot, he felt that his whole person was not very good. What kind of world was this? The 3 views of the world were so wrong. Out of wedlock, a mistress got married, and in the end, they still lived happily together. The 3 views of the world were all shocked. The original owner's wishes were, 1. Protect the Su family and not let the Xiao family annex the Su family. 2. She would rather die than divorce, so that Su Meng would be an illegitimate mistress for the rest of her life, and let the 2 vicious children be lowly illegitimate children forever. Since everyone said that she was vicious, she would be vicious to the end. Her character was quite unyielding. She would go down this path to the end, which was completely the rhythm of the evil. It was not long after being pushed down the stairs by Dabao and sent to the hospital. When Ning Shu just woke up, the person talking to the original owner's mother, Mrs. Su, was Xiao Yan. He was quite good-looking, but his attitude towards his wife was not so good. Ning Shu was more fortunate that she didn't have to sleep with Xiao Yan now. Ning Shu reckoned that Xiao Yan's face would be full of disgust. In fact, even if he wanted to get lost, Xiao Yan still had to stay chaste for Su Meng. If he wanted to sleep with someone, he had to sleep with the female lead, Su Meng. This time, Su Meng was very unhappy that Su Ran was pregnant. 2 months pregnant meant that after she came back, Xiao Yan still slept with the vicious Su Ran, which made Su Meng very disgusted. Because of this, in the ward just now, Xiao Yan was extremely disgusted with Su Ran. He almost directly said that she deserved it. It seemed that he didn't expect that Su Ran was also pregnant with his child. It was so cold. Love was originally beautiful, but based on the premise of destroying others, this kind of love was really disgusting. Chapter 71. Ning Shu began her miserable confinement. She couldn't take a shower or wash her hair. Mrs. Su didn't even want Ning Shu to brush her teeth, but Ning Shu couldn't stand it. No one from the Xiao family came to visit her while she was in the hospital. She was the young mistress of the Xiao family, wasn't she? But she felt like the original Su Ran was invisible. She didn't even have a sense of existence. If they didn't divorce, wouldn't it be better for them to live their own lives? What was the point? If this went on, Xiao Yan would definitely turn her into a deceased wife and marry Su Meng into the family. Thinking of the original Su Ran's fate, she could only say that she didn't seek death. She died miserably when she fought with the male and female lead. Mrs. Su was very unhappy that the Xiao family neglected her daughter. She took care of her daughter in the hospital without any clothes on. Ning Shu was a little touched. She should have seen how many people cared about her. Why did she have to spend her energy on a man who didn't want her? Mrs. Su looked at her daughter with a worried expression. She was careful in everything she did because she was afraid of touching her daughter's pain. Ning Shu didn't like the hospital at all. When she was alive, she spent 365 days a year in the hospital, so she felt disgusted staying in the hospital now. Ning Shu's confinement was almost over, but Xiao Yan didn't even come to visit her. He was so cold. She was his wife, wasn't he? It was as if he couldn't express his love for the female lead without being cruel to another woman. What an idiot. Ning Shu thought she would have a more leisurely confinement. When she was about to leave the hospital, she saw the female lead, Su Meng, come to visit her. Su Meng came to visit her. Ning Shu lay on the bed and looked at Su Meng. Su Meng was petite, and her soft hair was slightly curly. Coupled with her small, round face, she didn't look like a mother of a 6-year-old child at all. She was very delicate. Ning Shu wiped the feces from the corner of her eyes and rubbed it on Su Meng, who was standing beside the bed. Su Meng suddenly felt like she was struck by lightning. Her mouth twitched and she quickly put the bouquet on the bed, away from Ning Shu. Su Meng didn't say anything, and neither did Ning Shu. Mrs. Su looked at Su Meng with a sharp gaze, her eyes filled with undisguised disgust. It was obvious that she hated this niece of hers to the core. Su Meng ignored Mrs. Su's gaze. Su Meng clearly knew that although they were relatives, they were also enemies. Her parents had lost their lives because of her uncle's family. Her parents had never thought of competing with her uncle for anything, so why would they not let them off? Ning Shu lay on the bed and watched Su Meng's expression change. One moment it was resentful, the next moment it was melancholy, and the next moment it was hatred. In short, her expression was too complicated to describe. Ning Shu asked, "Why are you looking for me?" Su Meng looked at the woman lying on the bed with a complicated expression and said, "The Bao told me about you falling from downstairs. He wasn't careful." Ning Shu was speechless. Was she here to poke at her heart? Ning Shu pursed his lips and looked at Su Meng. Su Meng continued, "I'm very sorry for what happened. This is retribution." Retribution? Ning Shu sneered, "Why don't you tell me what kind of retribution it is? I'm afraid the retribution will be even greater for strangling a child who hasn't even seen the world. Everyone knows exactly what is going on. Now, you're running over to me to talk about retribution. This consort. Bah, what retribution?" Su Meng was frightened by Ning Shu's expression. She only felt that the person in front of her was incomparably fierce. Su Meng's heart surged with anger. She said coldly, "If you don't want anyone to know, don't do it in the first place. What kind of heinous things did your family do? Is that why your child didn't want you to be his mother and left you like this? Su Meng, you're not a good person either. What right do you have to talk about my daughter like that? Shameless bitch, you climbed into a man's bed and gave birth to his child. If I were you, I would have jumped off a building long ago. Don't you feel shame for being so thick-skinned?" Mrs. Su bombarded Su Meng indiscriminately. Su Meng took a few steps back after being scolded by Mrs. Su. She raised her chin and said, "You people will get retribution one day." Ning Shu laughed and said to Su Meng, "What retribution will I get? You stole someone else's husband, destroyed someone else's family, and are a mistress that everyone hates. Your child is an illegitimate child and can't be registered. You should be the one getting retribution." Ning Shu realized that Su Meng's words and actions were quite naive. Of course, the female lead had the right to be naive and muddle-headed. Men loved her. How muddle-headed was Su Meng? Here's an example. President Xiao Yan, "Woman, you stepped on my foot." Su Meng, sorry, President Xiao Yan, "Woman, you stepped on my left foot." She didn't know anything and decided the truth based on her own subjective feelings. No one else could be so willful other than the female lead. As for the death of Su Meng's parents, Ning Shu knew from the plot that the father of this body wanted to kill them, but they died in advance. Even the father of this body was shocked when he heard the news. He just wanted to kill them, but they died in the end. They were rushing to their deaths. Then, the female lead believed that her uncle's family killed her parents, and they had the motive and intention to do so. Ning Shu sighed. He felt that the death of the female lead's parents was all for Su Meng's beauty. Did she meet the one she was destined to meet? Canon Fodder was so miserable. When Su Meng heard Ning Shu accuse her of being a mistress, she was so angry that tears welled up in her almond-shaped eyes. She said angrily, "I'm not a mistress. I don't like your husband. You're the husband who came to me. I, Su Meng, don't want a man who has been used by others." Shrugging her shoulders, Ning Shu looked at Xiao Yan, who was standing at the door with an unsightly expression. Taking pleasure in Xiao Yan's misfortune, Ning Shu said to Xiao Yan, "Your true love said that you're a man that I've used before, and she doesn't want you." Su Meng turned and saw the tall and handsome Xiao Yan. Seeing his cold expression, Su Meng's heart trembled. She turned and pointed at Ning Shu and said angrily, "You're deliberately tricking me." Ning Shu said that she didn't need to trick him. Xiao Yan looked heartbroken and walked to Su Meng. Su Meng snorted and turned to leave the room, but Xiao Yan grabbed her arm. Su Meng struggled and shouted, "Go and grab your wife's hand. Why are you grabbing me? Let me tell you, I will never fall in love with you. Let me tell you, Su Meng. You're mine in this life." Xiao Yan grabbed Su Meng and pressed her body tightly against him. Xiao Yan held Su Meng's waist with one hand and his handsome face was serious. "I said, you're my only wife." Chapter 72. Ning Shu's mouth twitched as he watched Xiao Yan and Su Meng tugging at each other, almost hugging each other. Although Su Meng was struggling, their bodies inexplicably got closer and closer. How was this a quarrel? This was fucking flirting, wasn't it? "Let go of me, let go of me." Su Meng pounded on Xiao Yan's chest and shouted coquettishly, "Don't pester me anymore. You already have a wife, I don't want to be a mistress." Xiao Yan held Su Meng's waist tightly and said with a seductive smile, "I want to pester you. You are my woman, don't even think about leaving me in this lifetime. You have already given birth to 2 children for me, you are the mother of my children." "No, no." Su Meng pouted and gently pounded on Xiao Yan's chest with her little fist. Xiao Yan raised the corner of his mouth and smiled wickedly. "If I say you are, then you are." The two showed off their affection as if there was no one else around, completely disregarding whether others could take it or not. Ugh! Ning Shu really couldn't help but vomit. The two people who were hugging each other immediately glared at Ning Shu. Ning Shu quickly waved his hand. "Sorry, I really couldn't help it. I have never seen such a disgusting thing and couldn't help it." "Sorry, you can continue. Find another place to continue. Just don't fucking do it in front of her." Ning Shu felt that he should wash his eyes. The scene in front of him really broke his moral integrity and destroyed his 3 views. Showing off their affection in front of his wife and a mistress was simply stabbing a knife into his heart. Su Meng pushed Xiao Yan away and pointed at Xiao Yan with her white finger. She was angry but seemed to be acting coquettishly. "I'm warning you, don't come near me and don't touch me. I'm not interested in other women's husbands, humph." "Ning Shu, help!" Ning Shu clutched her chest and almost vomited blood. She didn't know how to describe the female lead, Su Meng. Silly and sweet. Innocent and delicate. Not scheming. That didn't seem to be the case. To be more precise, she was willful and pretentious. Her mouth said no, but her body was very honest. If she really had no interest in Xiao Yan, she could do what she did 7 years ago. She could hide so that Xiao Yan couldn't find her, or she could find a suitor to be the child's father. Anyway, Su Meng had plenty of suitors around her. Su Meng made a speech that seemed very impassioned, then turned around and left. Xiao Yan chased after her helplessly and angrily. Ning Shu felt the malice of the universe. She would rather kill people like in the previous world than face this kind of male and female lead. Ning Shu reflexively touched her waist, but she didn't find the whip. Could she just whip the 2 of them to death? Anyway, the original owner's wish was not to get divorced. Being a widow wasn't a bad idea. With a husband like Xiao Yan, she might as well be a widow. Ning Shu's heart was filled with killing intent. She really fell in love with this simple and violent way of solving problems. Su Ran, let me tell you, I will never fall in love with you. The one I love is Su Meng. Xiao Yan, who went to chase Su Meng, ran back to the ward and shouted at Ning Shu. Ning Shu was dumbfounded. Seeing this idiot shouting at her for no reason, Ning Shu blinked and tilted her head to look at Xiao Yan. Fuck, crazy. I didn't do anything. If you love Su Meng, then love Su Meng. Why the hell are you shouting in front of me? Ning Shu's heart was filled with curses. Su Ran, you better know your place. Don't provoke Su Meng. If you don't, I will make you suffer. Xiao Yan's face was cold, and his eyes were filled with extreme disgust. There was a kind of viciousness that couldn't wait to get rid of her, but he seemed to be worried about something. Ning Shu lifted the quilt and walked in front of Xiao Yan. Xiao Yan looked at Ning Shu coldly and sneered, Su Ran, give up. I will never fall in love with you, you vicious and hypocritical woman. Walking in front of Xiao Yan, Ning Shu found that Xiao Yan was really tall. He had a perfect inverted triangle figure with wide shoulders and a narrow waist. He wore a suit, which matched his handsome and perfectly sculpted face. He was handsome, rich, and had the powerful ability to do it 7 times a night. All the good things in the world were concentrated on him. He had all the requirements of a woman and a pervert. Fuck, Ning Shu had never seen such a pervert. He was obviously the one who cheated, but he was so righteous. Ning Shu didn't see any sense of responsibility for his family or his wife. He didn't have any sense of responsibility as a man. Instead, he treated his wife as the biggest obstacle in his love life. In the end, they could live happily together without any grudges. We don't understand the protagonist's world. Ning Shu sneered and raised her knee to Xiao Yan's crotch. Ning Shu used all her strength. She really couldn't stand Xiao Yan's chatter in front of her. Xiao Yan didn't expect that Ning Shu would hit his private part without saying anything. He immediately cried out in pain, and his handsome face was distorted. He held the wall with one hand and covered his crotch with the other. His legs were clamped, and he bent over in extreme pain. Hiss, you! Xiao Yan stared at Ning Shu with red eyes, looking shocked and painful. Obviously, he didn't expect that the woman who usually adored him would suddenly hit him. It was really painful. Ning Shu sneered and patted Xiao Yan's shoulder, who was bending over and covering his crotch. Do you feel very painful? Do you feel like your heart is breaking? The pain I felt when I lost my child was 1,000 times more painful than this. Tut, 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 Su Ran. Xiao Yan's voice almost came out from between his teeth, which looked very gloomy and horrible. His eyes were red, and he looked like he was going to swallow Ning Shu alive. He reached out his hand and grabbed Ning Shu's wrist tightly. He was so strong that he wanted to break Ning Shu's wrist. Ning Shu's expression didn't change at all. She endured the pain in her hand and used all her strength to give Xiao Yan a big slap on the face. With a bang, Xiao Yan's head was knocked askew. Ning Shu said lightly, "Let go." Xiao Yan was almost stunned by Ning Shu's slap in the face. Then, his heart was filled with extreme anger and humiliation. He, Xiao Yan, had never been slapped in his life, let alone in such a way. Xiao Yan breathed heavily and turned his head to look at Ning Shu viciously. His eyes were red and filled with the desire to destroy the world, as if he was about to devour someone. Facing Xiao Yan's eyes, Ning Shu's expression didn't change. His sister even dared to kill people. How could this kind of eyes scare her? Let go. Ning Shu said lightly. Xiao Yan pulled Ning Shu's hand hard, almost crushing Ning Shu's wrist. Let go. Slap. A big slap in the face. Let go. Slap. Another big slap in the face. I said, let go. Slap, slap. The big slaps continued. Chapter 73. Although Xiao Yan was a man, his skin was very tender and smooth. Ning Shu slapped his face again and felt that it was slippery. With one hand being grabbed by Xiao Yan, Ning Shu could only focus on one side of Xiao Yan's face. After a while, half of Xiao Yan's face was swollen and bruised, forming a sharp contrast with the handsome face on the other side. Xiao Yan slowly turned his head to look at Ning Shu, a storm brewing in his eyes. He looked at Ning Shu maliciously. You're very good, hiss. Xiao Yan originally wanted to scare Ning Shu, but as soon as he spoke, he pulled the wound on his face and tears came down from the pain. Xiao Yan was going crazy. Seeing that Ning Shu was about to raise his hand to hit him again, he stopped covering his crotch and grabbed Ning Shu's raised hand. He squeezed Ning Shu's hands tightly and shouted, "You bitch." Ning Shu sneered. He didn't have hands but feet. Ning Shu quickly raised his foot and kicked Xiao Yan's crotch. Ning Shu's kick made Xiao Yan's eyes almost pop out of their sockets. He fell to the ground and covered his crotch, howling. Blue veins popped out on his forehead and cold sweat dripped down. Ning Shu moved his wrist, which was pinched by Xiao Yan, and turned blue. Ning Shu coldly looked at Xiao Yan who was rolling on the ground. What a useless piece of trash. In the last world, Ning Shu had always wanted to kick Helianing to make her unable to have children, but he didn't get what he wanted. They were both men, but Xiao Yan was really a weakling. Ran Air, are you okay? Mrs. Su watched everything that happened just now. Seeing her daughter like this, she intuitively felt that her daughter had been driven crazy by Su Ran and Xiao Yan, this pair of bitches. Ning Shu shook his head. Mom, I'm fine. Then he walked to the bedside and pressed a button to call the doctor. Nurse, there's a patient with broken testicles. Come and save him. Ning Shu said lightly. Xiao Yan, who was in incomparable pain, heard Ning Shu's words. His eyes were bloodshot as he stared at Ning Shu. His hatred was monstrous, as if he was about to devour someone. Coupled with his pig-like face, how could he not look funny? Not enough. Ning Shu raised his eyebrows and asked Xiao Yan. Ning Shu raised his foot. I can give you another kick. Su Ran, you'll regret messing with me. Xiao Yan's words were intermittent, and he was in so much pain that he couldn't stop breathing. Then, he stood up with the help of the wall and was about to walk away. Xiao Yan would never do it in such a private place. Otherwise, the headlines tomorrow would be that the president of Zhao's group was dying and that he had to go to the andrology department. Xiao Yan couldn't afford to lose face. Every step Xiao Yan took made his body tremble and sweat profusely. The muscles on his face trembled, which pulled the swollen wound on his face and made it even more painful. Su Ran, Su Ran. When Xiao Yan walked out of the ward, he turned to Ning Shu and called Su Ran's name through gritted teeth. It was very gloomy. Ning Shu smacked his lips. Look at you. I thought you fell in love with me. Xiao Yan coughed violently. Su Ran, you're shameless. Ning Shu shrugged and looked indifferent. Who in the world is more shameless than you? Xiao Yan, you are the most shameless person in the world. The nurse and doctor called by Ning Shu pushed the bed over. Seeing Xiao Yan, who was standing at the door with his legs clamped, they ignored Xiao Yan's struggle and opposition and pressed him on the bed, saying that they were going to push him to the operating room. Ning Shu thought viciously. He didn't know if they would cut off that part. If she couldn't have sex with Xiao Yan, would Su Meng still want it? Ning Shu felt some regret in her heart. If she could practice peerless martial arts in this world, her strength would be much greater. She could kick Xiao Yan until he was crippled. If she slapped him, Xiao Yan would definitely have a concussion. After coming to this world, Ning Shu tried to practice the martial arts of the last world when he felt better, but he didn't succeed. Every world had its own rules. Imagine a world with endless traffic. It was unreasonable for a person to be able to fly over roofs and vault over walls. Moreover, the spiritual energy in this world couldn't be used for practice. Ran air. Mrs. Su looked at Ning Shu worriedly. Won't Xiao Yan hate you more if you do this? Are you pushing Xiao Yan to that little bitch Su Meng? It's okay, Mom. I know what to do. Ning Shu sneered in his heart. She was not in love with Xiao Yan. Besides, the original host didn't ask her to get Xiao Yan back. Why should she swallow the insult? Otherwise, Xiao Yan and Su Meng would come to her every day to disgust her. Mrs. Su saw that Ning Shu was calm and didn't have the pain and madness of losing the children. She said, "You have to save face. If you treat Xiao Yan like this, your parents-in-law will have a problem with you." Her existence was a mistake. No matter what she did, Xiao Yan's parents would have a problem with it. Especially now that they had 2 golden grandchildren. The original host Su Ran was a thorn in their side. However, for the sake of the Su family, they didn't divorce her. But the title of the young madam of the Xiao family existed in name only. You'll be discharged tomorrow. Are you going back to the Su family or the Xiao family? Mrs. Su asked Ning Shu. After thinking for a while, she said, now that little bitch Su Meng has a strong momentum because she gave birth to 2 children for Xiao Yan. Let's go home first. There will always be a chance to deal with that little bitch. Now Xiao Yan is hot to that little bitch. When Xiao Yan is tired of her, it will be our chance. Ning Shu shook her head and said, I'm the young madam of the Xiao family. Of course I'll go back to the Xiao family. After that, I'll go back to the Su family. I have something to discuss with my father. If the plot was right, the Su family and the Mu family were cooperating, but the Su family was directly hollowed out on a project. This was a trap set by Xiao Yan. He dealt with the Su family because of Su Ran, the annoying existence, and also to avenge Su Meng's parents. The woman he loved was wronged. Of course, he would seek justice. In addition to what she had just done to Xiao Yan, now Xiao Yan wanted to eat her flesh and drink her blood. Just now she had plucked the tiger's whiskers. She had to think about her own life. She might as well kill Xiao Yan. Tut tut, this was not good. It was too violent. Ning Shu thought that she was a gentle person. How could she let Xiao Yan die so easily? Besides, murder was illegal. This was not the ancient time where human life was worthless. The original owner of the body did not want to be a murderer. Ning Shu thought about it in her heart. If Xiao Yan didn't have his current status, he wouldn't have the capital to be proud of, and he wouldn't have the courage to throw away money like that. How would he be able to flirt with Su Meng, be lovey-dovey, be lovey-dovey? All romance was built on money. In order to survive, ordinary people always wanted to earn money to support themselves. How could they have the time and money to be romantic? Without the halo, Xiao Yan was down and out. He had to run for 3 meals a day. Would Su Meng still be with him? Maybe. After all, it was true love. So she decided to protect the Su family from being annexed by the Xiao family. At the same time, if possible, it would be best to destroy the Xiao family. Chapter 74. The next day, Ning Shu was discharged from the hospital and returned to Zhao's house with a bag of things. Zhao's house was very big, with a villa garden, statues and fountains. It looked like a top-rich family. When Ning Shu returned to Zhao's house, no one came to receive her. She was completely treated as an invisible person. This kind of embarrassment was unbearable for most people. But Ning Shu calmly walked into the living room. Before she saw anyone, she heard the laughter in the hall. There were adults' hearty voices mixed with children's innocent laughter. Ning Shu glanced around and saw the spacious living room. The floor was full of various toys. Xiao Yan's parents were sitting on the sofa and playing with the two children. Ning Shu carefully looked at the two babies. One of them was Su Debao, who looked like a little adult. He was very cute, with white and tender skin, a pair of purple grape-like eyes, and slightly curly hair. He was wearing suspenders and a small red bow tie on his shirt. He looked very serious, which made people's hearts melt. One of them was Su Xiaobao, who was dressing the dolls. He had soft and slightly curly hair like Su Meng and looked extremely sweet. Wearing a tutu skirt, he looked like a little princess who was favored by the heavens. The two children were really cute. However, if it wasn't for Su Debao's actions, Ning Shu would have really praised the two children's appearance that defied the heavens. As soon as Ning Shu came in, the happy atmosphere froze, as if a cold current swept by. Everyone's eyes were focused on Ning Shu, especially Su Debao, who tilted his head and looked at Ning Shu. His eyes flashed with a sly and mischievous light, but it made Ning Shu's back hair stand up. How is this a child's eyes? Su Debao is really a dangerous existence. He has a smart brain, but he doesn't have a sense of right and wrong. He does things according to his mood. For example, the original Su Ran was pregnant. Su Debao immediately knew that the child in the original Su Ran's belly would threaten the relationship between his father and his mother, and also threaten the position of him and his sister, so he pushed her downstairs. She was really vicious. She had the naivety and cruelty of a child. Ning Shu's impression of Su Meng became even worse. Since she had given birth to a child, she should educate the child and set up a correct worldview for the child. However, Su Meng was busy getting into trouble and being lovable in a daze. Sometimes, Su Debao, who was still a child, had to deal with the aftermath. The money that Su Debao earned was enough for Su Meng to live comfortably. He was like a mature child, but Su Debao felt that he could protect his mother and was very happy with his sister. It was a completely deformed mother-son relationship. Ning Shu walked in as if there was no one around. Madame Xiao stood up. Ning Shu said, "You're back." Ning Shu nodded and went upstairs. Seeing that Ning Shu ignored them like this, Master Xiao and Madame Zhao's face turned ugly. They turned to look at the back of Ning Shu going upstairs. Master Xiao frowned, dissatisfaction flashed across his face. If Madame Xiao didn't have a child in front of her, she would have already scolded Ning Shu. What does it mean to not divorce even if you die? Madame Xiao wasn't so satisfied with Su Meng, but for the sake of a pair of children, she accepted Su Meng. However, Su Ran also didn't have good eyesight. She shouldn't have taken the initiative to divorce. Su Debao's eyes turned and his face immediately smiled. He threw himself into Master Zhao's arms and said, "Grandpa, don't be angry." Debao doesn't want Grandpa to be angry. Mommy said that anger is bad for people's health. Yes, Xiaobao also doesn't want Grandpa to be angry. Su Xiaobao put down the doll and said to Master Xiao. Master Xiao suddenly smiled and touched Su Debao's head. Okay, Grandpa won't be angry. Grandpa doesn't like to be angry. Humph, you only care about whether your grandpa is angry or not. Grandma is also angry. Madame Xiao said this, but her face showed a sincere and kind smile. Su Xiaobao immediately touched Madame Zhao's face with his small hand and said with a serious face, "Grandma, don't be angry. Anger will make you old." Xiaobao hopes that Grandma will always be so beautiful and young. Madame Xiao felt that her heart was about to melt. This was simply the two treasures that God gave to the Xiao family. Ning Shu didn't care about how lovey-dovey the grandfather and grandson were. When he returned to the bedroom, he put away the jewelry on the dressing table and some particularly valuable things. Many of the things were the dowry of the original owner and were very valuable. After the original owner Su Ran was defeated in the Su family, she was kicked out of the house by Xiao Yan. Xiao Yan gave a lot of the original owner's things to Su Meng. He also said that he got back all the things that Su Meng lost. These things should have been Su Meng's. Ning Shu felt like she was drunk. She was so drunk that she couldn't take it. Ning Shu put the jewelry and some precious shares in the bag and then prepared to go to the bank to open a safe. These things were to be left for the cruel and unscrupulous people. Not to mention that the original owner didn't agree, even Ning Shu wanted to vomit. Even Ning Shu, an outsider, couldn't help but feel angry. There was actually such a shameless person in the world. He was simply a strange space carrier. Ning Shu went downstairs with a bag of things. The happy atmosphere that Su Debao and Su Xiaobao tried to create was frozen by Ning Shu. Ning Shu suddenly felt that he had become the king of awkward silence. When he walked to the door, Ning Shu suddenly turned back and said to the people in the living room, "I will be back for lunch. Remember to leave some food for me. I want to eat abalone at noon. Tell the kitchen to leave some for me. It must be left. I had a miscarriage and need to nourish my body." As Ning Shu spoke, his eyes stopped on Su Debao. Su Debao looked at Ning Shu innocently with his head tilted. "Auntie, why are you looking at me? I am not an abalone." Ning Shu looked at Su Debao seriously and said, "You shouldn't call me auntie. You should call me auntie. In ancient times, your mother was a concubine. I am your mother." Su Debao's face suddenly became gloomy. A pair of eyes looked at Ning Shu fiercely. He secretly made a throat-slitting gesture to Ning Shu, which really made people feel cold. Ning Shu's expression didn't change. In the end, he was still a child. He couldn't help but add fuel to the fire. "Remember to call me auntie in the future. Call your mother little mom." Su Debao could hold it in, but Su Xiaobao suddenly burst into tears. "My mother is not my stepmother. No, you bad woman." Seeing their baby crying, the two elders of the Xiao family suddenly panicked and coaxed the crying child. "Su Ran, why are you saying this to a child? What are you saying?" Mrs. Xiao glared at Ning Shu. "Oh, baby, don't cry. Grandma's heart hurts." Ning Shu curled her lips. "Is there any justice? She was just telling the truth. What's wrong with her? Why is her heart so fragile? She allowed Su Meng to do it and didn't let others say it." Chapter 75. Ning Shu was too lazy to look at the grandparent and grandchild affectionate scene. She said to the servant at home, "Remember to get me abalone." Ning Shu's words made the four of them stare at her, especially Su Debao, who looked at Ning Shu with a particularly gloomy expression. Su Xiaobao was coaxing his sister while crying loudly. He looked at Ning Shu through the gaps between his fingers. As long as Ning Shu's eyes met his, he would immediately burst into tears. It was as if he was scared to tears by Ning Shu. He cried pitifully. "Now that the child is crying like this, you still say that it's abalone. Su Ran, have you never eaten abalone in your 8 lifetimes?" Mrs. Xiao coaxed Su Xiaobao while glaring at Ning Shu. "Ning Shu, she really hasn't eaten abalone in her 8 lifetimes. Sure enough, her existence was a mistake. No matter what she did, it was a mistake." Ning Shu turned around and left. She was not going to beg the Xiao family. Even a child as young as her was giving her attitude and scheming behind her back. It must have been hard for the naive Su Meng to give birth to such a scheming child. Could it be that the Xiao family's genes were like this? Toward Ning Shu's attitude, it could be said that the Xiao family's couple was furious. A daughter-in-law was so arrogant. She actually had such an attitude toward the elderly. Look at what kind of daughter-in-law she married. Marry a virtuous wife. How could such a woman be the future matriarch of the Xiao family? Ning Shu didn't care about what others thought. First, she went to the bank to open a safe and locked everything. After everything was done, Ning Shu returned to the Su family to see the father of this body. Ning Shu couldn't believe that a person who had been in the business world for half his life would fall into the hands of Xiao Yan, who was younger than him. And, the protagonist's aura didn't need to be explained. When the supporting characters met the protagonist, their IQ would plummet to below the normal level. Su Ran's father was an elegant middle-aged man with a calm temperament. He looked like a mature and elegant businessman. When he saw Ning Shu, he looked at Ning Shu from head to toe and said, "You've just been discharged from the hospital. Don't run around." Ning Shu smiled and said, "Dad, I'm fine now." Mr. Su frowned when he saw the smile on Ning Shu's face. "How can you still smile in this situation? You can't even protect your own child, falling into the hands of a 6-year-old child. Don't you think it's embarrassing? Are you still my daughter?" Ning Shu secretly curled his lips. "Aren't you going to fall into Xiao Yan's hands in the future?" Not a single strand of hair was left in the Su family. They were all plundered by Xiao Yan. "Father, I was wrong. What else could I have done? Those 2 children have subdued the entire Xiao family. Now, I don't even have a place to stand in the Xiao family." Ning Shu said pitifully. "What a good-for-nothing. You can't even compare with a child." Su Bo frowned tightly. "If this goes on, I'm afraid that the business between the Su family and the Xiao family will collapse." "Dad." Ning Shu looked at Su Bo seriously. "Let's not cooperate with the Xiao family. Now Su Meng and Xiao Yan are in love, and Xiao Yan said that he would avenge Su Meng and her parents. Su Meng always thought that it was you who killed her parents. We should look for a new breakthrough." Ning Shu's face was gloomy, as if he had been betrayed by a man. Su Bo's face changed. He was skeptical about the news and said, "Business is business. Xiao Yan won't destroy the business of 2 families for a woman." Ning Shu responded to Su Bo's words with a smile. For Su Meng, Xiao Yan would do anything. Otherwise, how could he express his love for Su Meng and fulfill the 2 children's wish to be together as a family and their parents love each other? "Since you're married, you should take care of your husband and children. Don't get involved in the business." Su Bo said, "Take good care of yourself and give birth to an heir for the Xiao family. As for Su Meng's 2 children, they are illegitimate children. They can't shake your position." Ning Shu's heart sank. She didn't expect Su Bo to be so stubborn and not believe what she said at all. Could it be that the Su family really couldn't escape the fate of being annexed? Ning Shu thought for a moment and felt that she was too impatient. The business between the Xiao family and the Su family had always been good and nothing had gone wrong. She rashly said that the Xiao family was going to deal with the Su family. Of course, Su Bo didn't believe her. Su Bo probably thought that she was crazy because of the loss of her children and Su Meng, her love rival, so she said such a harmful idea. Ning Shu felt that it was necessary to find evidence to make Su Bo believe her, but she couldn't pin all her hopes on the Su family. She finally understood why the Su family was defeated in an instant. It was because Su Bo trusted the Xiao family too much and didn't expect that Xiao Yan would destroy the Su family in one fell swoop. "Ran Air, do you want to have lunch at home?" Madame Su asked Ning Shu. Ning Shu shook her head. She had achieved her goal today. "I'm not eating at home." Ning Shu said to Su Bo seriously, "Father, soon, the Xiao family will develop a piece of land. It's said that it's planned by the Jing family. When the time comes, the Su family will definitely be involved. This case is Xiao Yan's plan to deal with the He family. Maybe I'm overthinking, but father, please be careful." Ning Shu reminded Su Bo that if the Su family's path didn't work, there were other paths to take. After spending a short time with Su Bo, Ning Shu found that Su Bo was actually a person who looked down on women. Moreover, his daughter was married. Strictly speaking, she wasn't a member of the Su family. Su Bo was probably still angry that he suddenly came back to sow discord between the two families. Ning Shu thought about it and felt that it was quite boring. He came back with good intentions, but in the end, Su Bo didn't appreciate it at all. When Ning Shu was about to leave, the brother of the original Su Ran came back. Su Lan was currently studying in university. When she saw Ning Shu call her sister, her gaze moved to Ning Shu's stomach. Ning Shu said, "Sister, don't be too sad. It's all because the child is immature." Ning Shu narrowed his eyes. How could he say that? Ning Shu looked at Su Lan. Su Lan looked like Su Bo. She was wearing a white shirt and looked gentle. She had a noble aura around her. She was the school hunk. Who told you that Su Debao was careless? Ning Shu frowned and looked at Su Lan. Su Lan's face showed a disapproving expression. Cousin Su Meng has already explained to me that the child was careless. Sister, you're very sad that you lost your child, but you can't push all the blame to an immature child. These words were directly saying that even if you want to frame someone, don't frame a child. Ning Shu looked up to the sky and roared in his heart. Another man kneeling under the halo of Mary Sue. Under the halo of Mary Sue, all men kneel or become cannon fodder. Ning Shu felt his heart twitching. A feeling of sadness filled his heart. His own brother didn't believe him. Instead, he spoke up for Su Meng. The original Su Meng was angry and helpless facing such a brother. She hated Su Meng even more. However, Ning Shu only had one feeling. She wanted to slap this kid. You're tuning into the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.